Well, good morning, and welcome to the October the 8th, 2019 Historic Site Preservation Board monthly meeting. May we have a roll call, please?
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chair. Members Rosenau and members Huff are absent today. Member Kaiser?
Here.
Member Dixon?
Present.
Member Lavoie is absent. Chair Burkett
Here.
and Member Nelson. You have a quorum.
Thank you. May we have a report on the posting of the agenda, please?
The agenda for this meeting was posted for public review at the City Hall Bulletin Board in the west side of Council Chamber and at the Planning Department counter in accordance with state law.
Excuse me. Does the board have any revisions of the agenda?
Mr. Chair, we would just note that we have listed on the agenda a study session at 12 o'clock noon to discuss modifications to the Racket Club property. The applicant emailed us yesterday and indicated that they don't have materials available yet, nor have they been able to schedule the tours for the HSPB members, and so consequently they are requesting to table that item. So in your acceptance of the agenda, please note that the study session item at 12 noon will be canceled.
Okay, thank you very much. So may I have a motion to accept the agenda as with the amendment?
Move to approve amending that the study session at 12 noon is canceled to further notice.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
So we have a motion by, excuse me, by, gosh. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? No? Seeing none? All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries 4-0. It's time for public comment. And I'm delighted to see so many people here today. We love it when you come and visit us. So we're going to move on to public comments. This time has been set aside for the members of the public to address the Historic Site Preservation Board on agenda items and items of general interest within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. Although the Historic Site Preservation Board values your comments pursuant to the Brown Act, it generally cannot take any action on items not listed on the posted agenda. There will be 3 minutes assigned for each speaker. Testimony for public hearings will be taken at the time of the hearing, and we have 3 public hearings today. So do we have anyone from the audience wishing to address the board today on non-public hearing items? Yes, you please come forward, please. Oh, we canceled the study session for the Racket Club, which would have been held a separate meeting after this one at 12 noon.
We're not having that today at all?
No.
Are we having it sometime?
We will, there'll be plans to reschedule that meeting, and it'll be so posted. Okay? Yes. Anyone else wishing to address the audience? Okay, please come forward.
I'm Chris Minrad. I'm a board member of the Palm Springs Modern Committee, and I'm here to talk to you about a recent event that occurred with a home. It's specifically 423 Morito Place, and I just want to give you a little bit of history about this house. It's not by any famous architect, or at least not somebody that's a common name, nor did anybody famous live there. But what was really remarkable about this little house is that it was completely intact. When the owner, who's the second owner, purchased it 20 years ago, that's the reason he moved to Palm Springs. He was in escrow in Phoenix, and he told his agent, if that house ever comes on the market, let me know. It did, and so he got out of his escrow and bought it. He maintained it for the next 20 years to perfection. He improved certain things so that it wouldn't there's some wood pieces and things like that, roofs, all that stuff that, needs maintenance, he took care of it. The Palm Springs Modern Committee gave him a preservation award. I'm not sure when. I think it was about 5 or 7 years ago. Needless to say, it changed hands. He died, unfortunately, and it changed hands. And the new person has some different ideas about it. It's been suggested, if it's so important, why didn't preservation community come up and bring it up ahead of time or work with the owner or whatever? And I think the answer to that is we promulgated what we thought was a really good preservation ordinance. And so we figured that would do the work for us, but that may not have happened. So what I want to find out is, and what I'm asking is, there's section 3 of that ordinance that lists A through G, 7 items, all of which this particular owner is fully capable of providing. They have all those things. So we would like to know what they provided and what the process was that allowed the house to be so dismantled. And, hopefully the ordinance as written is still good, but we need to have a deeper dive understanding of why this really important house, it's part of our brand, this little house was completely all there, and for it to not be is a little bit disconcerting. So that is what I'm asking for. And that's it. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us what year the house was built?
57.
Who you think was the builder or architect, and who the original owner was?
So the builder was Coffey. I forgot his first name. The owner's name was Laufer, Emil and Ruth Laufer, and it turns out after years and years of trying to figure out who the architect was, the owner chose Jim Reed. He basically had it for the last 20 years and maintained it. Didn't know, and then he suggested to me one day, "Oh, I have all her diaries in the library." And I go, "What?" And so I ran over there and I went through them all, and I knew the date the permit had been pulled, and I found that these people had been talking to Neutra, Cody, Richard Dorman in LA, all these different architects about trying to design a house. So they knew what they were doing. They finally settled, based on the way this diary went, on Wexler and Harrison. So I assumed it was a Harrison house because the entries were always Harrison, Harrison, Harrison in the diary after that. Oops, I'm out of time. Anyway, the bottom line is they found the plans in the house. They are by Richard Harrison. It was then later value engineered by an architect whose name is Joe Kiktavi. We don't know a lot about him. He did do the Chamber of Commerce building, probably lots of other things. And so that's the architect ultimately, is Joe Kiktavi.
Thank you, Chris, for putting that into the record.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Just so you know, there will be a review of the demolition and alteration of Class 3 and Class 4 under staff comments later on today. So do we have any other speakers on non-public hearing items? Seeing no further speakers, we'll move right on to the consent calendar. The approval of the minutes for September the 10th, 2019 HSPB meeting.
Approved as presented.
Second.
We have a first and a second. We have any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes 4-0. Okay, now it's time for public hearings. The first item is 2A, which is an application by the City of Palm Springs, owner seeking Class 1 Historic Site designation for the O'Donnell Golf Residence at the O'Donnell Golf Course located at 301 North Villardo Road. May I have a staff report, please?
Mr. Chair, before Mr. Lyon begins his staff report, at our last meeting, when we distributed copies of the historic resource report, it was requested that staff consult with the mayor to see if the designation could also include the golf course and the accessory structures. Those items were outside the original direction that we had been given by the mayor back in June of this year. The mayor said, yes, we should include those items. So what I've done is I've given you a memo which includes consideration of the golf course, landscaping, and the accessory structures, and identifies from the report the character-defining features, the non-contributing features, and then also certain missing features on some of the structures there that we would want to look at replacing at a later date. One of the comments I want to make up front is I do have a concern relative to the golf course that, number one, the tamarisk trees are not typically a drought-tolerant tree, and looking into the future as we want to preserve the character-defining features, I just want to put that into the record that we may need to look for some other type of tree in the future as water resources become more scarce. We want to retain the windbreak around the perimeter of the property and the alignment of the trees that help to define the fairways, but I'd just make that comment relative to the tamarisk trees. And then secondly, on the turf, again, for the same reasons, we have limitations in our code about the use of turf, and so we need to take that into consideration as we look at preservation of this. Is it possible that there's some way that we could retain the character and feeling by using more water-efficient methods? Just two things to consider. I wanted to put that out there as part of that. But again, the intent today, if you choose to include it, as part of your motion is to include the course itself and the accessory structures. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Lyon, and he'll go ahead and finish with the staff report.
Thank you, Flynn. So as noted in your staff report, this was an item that was brought forward by the mayor on the June 5th, 2019 City Council meeting requesting that the staff consider the Thomas O'Donnell Golf Course House for possible Class 1 historic designation. Concurrent with that, the Palm Springs Preservation Foundation began working with the O'Donnell Golf Course Club on the historic resources report that you have as part of this particular application. It's important to note, as I've noted in the opening paragraph of the report here, the distinction between who is the owner, what is the status of the position of the golf club, and what is the land or the parcel on which we're looking at. So it is the city that is the owner, not the golf club, even though the report asserts that it's the golf club that's giving their endorsement of the report. The golf club is the tenant. They are the tenant of the city, and they have a 99-year lease to operate the golf club on the O'Donnell Golf Course. And then there is the land that comprises the golf course itself, which is comprised of several parcels, some of which were deeded to the city in 1944, others which the city took on purchase in 1969 and subsequent. So if you turn in your staff report to page 2, there's a little bit of information that I've given you. Many people understand and know the history of Thomas O'Donnell very well. However, O'Donnell was an incredibly significant person here in Palm Springs in terms of his time and philanthropic activities that carried on really through the 20s until his passing in the mid-40s. O'Donnell's first home, as most of us know, is the O'Donnell House that's located high up on the side of the mountain, which was done in 1925 in collaboration with Nellie Kaufman, who owned the Desert Inn. It was O'Donnell's visitation to the Desert Inn that brought him familiarity with Palm Springs, and at that time in the 20s when he truly fell in love with Palm Springs. At that time, there was no golf course in Palm Springs. And so when O'Donnell spoke with Kaufman, she gave him some land adjacent to the inn, and they created a small course commonly referred to as a mashie course, which I learned through this particular application is a small, short golf course, which still has relevancy today, but comes out of the Scottish legacy of golf. That's footnoted in your bottom of page 2. I thought it was an interesting piece of detail of things that you learn as you go through these reports. So in the 1920s and 1930s, O'Donnell bought land from Prescott Stevens and went through a very long process of building this golf course. By the time he was in the 1930s, he was beginning to have failing health, and they were spending more time here in the desert. And so they determined that they wanted to build another house on the golf course and move down from the house that was on the hill that they had built in the 20s. The house that was built was a roughly 4,000 square foot home, also done by, the same architect that had done the house on the hill, William Tanner. The golf course house then became O'Donnell's house beginning in 1936, And again, because of his health, the issue of going up and down the hill, and the fact that they were able to introduce air conditioning into the golf house brought them into a new residency adjacent to the course. The analysis of the house begins on page 3 and 4 of your report. There's aerial photos showing the location of it relative to the golf course, and then a close-up showing the house as it exists today. There have been many changes to the house. The city bought the house in 1969 for purposes of creating it and using it as a golf clubhouse for the golf club. So there have been some changes that have been made. These are identified mostly on page 4 of your staff report. The long screened-in covered veranda that was across the east side of the building has been enclosed with aluminum frame windows to expand the dining capacity of the clubhouse, so the veranda no longer exists in its original form. There was also, to the south side of the house, an aviary that O'Donnell had constructed in '27. This was dismantled in 1952 and donated to the Griffith Park Zoo in Los Angeles. The north wing extended eastward at an open angle and included a bay window. Those areas are still extant. There was also a south wing on the house, which had service areas, and that portion was demolished when the city converted the house to a clubhouse in 1969. There have also been changes to the exterior areas of the golf course, as noted in the report. O'Donnell had a series of cottonwood trees planted along the east side of the house to provide shade. Those have long since died, and they have been replaced with a couple of very large ficus trees. There's also a large dining terrace on the east side of the house that's comprised of precast concrete pavers. That is not part of the original character-defining features of the house, but was added later to expand the dining capacity of the clubhouse. Because this is a public building, I took the liberty to take some photos inside the house so that there's an understanding of what some of the components are of this building beyond just the simple nature of its celebrity owner, if you want to call it that, and the architectural style. So on page 5 of your staff report, there are some pictures that's showing some of the areas of the interior, particularly the living room, which serves as a part of the dining capacity for the building. There's a very handsome wood ingle nook that's surrounding the fireplace, and you can see in the second photo on page 5, there is a very beautiful timbered gable roof or ceiling in that living room that still is intact. So the analysis of this project against the ordinance begins on page 6 of your staff report. Staff has asserted that this project has significance as a potential historic site because of its association with Thomas O'Donnell. It's also a good example of the Spanish colonial revival and Andalusian farmhouse building topology. It has its relevancy to the golf course, which is the oldest surviving golf course in the Coachella Valley, and its association with the golf club, which has owned it and operated it, well, not owned it, but has been tenancy there since the O'Donnell created it in the 30s and 40s. On page 7 of your staff report, I've addressed the analysis of the project against the issue of the work of a master builder, designer, or architect. In this case, William Charles Tanner had already established a thriving practice in Los Angeles, working for many affluent clients in the Los Angeles area. His work in the desert has also been fairly well documented, including the O'Donnell House that's up on the hillside. Looking at the issues of integrity, beginning on page 8 of your staff report, I've already noted that there is a loss of the south wing of the house when the city took it over. That wing was demolished in order to provide parking for the golf club. The screened-in veranda along the east side has been enclosed with aluminum windows, which slightly impair its integrity. You'll also notice on the photos on page 9, the back of the house, while this certainly was built as a house and was used as a house for many years, since it's become the golf clubhouse, the back end of the house, which would have been some of the more private areas of outdoor living, have really become utilitarian in nature, where there's storage of furniture and outdoor heaters and so on. I want to bring your attention to the bottom of page 9. There's a couple of photos there of some of the ceilings that are in the dining room and study, which have been painted over. It's my belief that when the house was probably originally constructed, those were probably not painted, but were probably natural finished, varnished, or lacquered wood. and that any restoration might take a look at whether that area would be restored back to its original clear finish, wood finish. On page 10 of your staff report, there are some photos there addressing the veranda. And obviously, as this building started off as a home and was then pushed into service for commercial use, the kitchen was modified to provide the services and the capacities that a commercial kitchen would require. So there is a photo there of the kitchen areas that have been changed from the house's original configuration as a single-family residence. As we always try to work with these reports, we look at what are those features that are the defining characteristics of the home and what are the non-contributing features. Many times when we're dealing with revival-style architecture, we see a lot of features and details, light fixtures, gates, fountains, and so on, that have been added that are in the nature of or in the style of the architecture of the building, but however, which are not original fabric. And so we've tried to identify those things that we were aware of that are of that nature. And on the top of page 11, the non-contributing features that we've identified are the enclosure of the veranda, the fabric awnings on the windows and the entry door, the interior modifications made after 1969, the ficus trees, and the precast concrete pavers. In looking at the golf course and open space and other buildings, of course, in the report, you have a fairly comprehensive review of those other buildings, including the gatehouse, the pro shop, a toilet facility that was on the site, and the carriage house. Those are identified on page 11 of your staff report, and of course, the report does go into greater detail on the qualifications and integrity of each. There is a slight nuance that I want to simply point out to you in the report, and I'll use the example of the modest little toilet building. When we look at defining characteristics here at the city on these applications, we're looking at the currently existing components. So if you will note in the Historic Resources report, the small, and I'm using this as an example for you to understand, the small little bathroom building was given new clay tile roof tiles. They're flat. When you look at the original historic photos that are in the report, they do note that those were barrel tiles. So while the report lists the tiles as defining characteristics, the current set of tiles are not original. And so we would, as a custom and a practice, not list them as defining characteristics. And here's the reason why. Move ourselves many years into the future when this roof probably has to be replaced. A future board is going to consider that application to replace those roof tiles. When those roof tiles get replaced, if we say that the current roof tiles, which are flat, are the defining characteristic, then we will replace them with flat roof tiles, which is incorrect. If those roof tiles on that little bathroom building are to be replaced, they should be replaced with barrel tile. So this is just a minor distinction and nuance that I want to point out to you, that when we look at things in terms of a defining characteristic, we're not looking at the things that were original that are lost. We're looking at the things that are original that are intact. And we're looking at the things that have been added since then that may be in keeping with or in the style of the architecture of the building or the architecture of the site, but which are not, in fact, original characteristics. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I have not gone into much of the detail of the report that Flynn provided for you, but on this additional memo that you have that was passed around to you, we have identified character-defining features of the golf course, things that have been lost or that are non-contributing, the carriage house, the gatehouse, the restroom structure, and the golf shop. And so those are available for you if you wish to discuss them. Our recommendation is that since the original task that was put before us by the mayor was to look at the golf clubhouse, that being the O'Donnell Golf House, that's what we have done the analysis on. And our recommendation is that that building does qualify and have the ability to qualify as a historic site. So it's our recommendation that the golf house be forwarded by this board to the City Council with a recommendation for Class 1 historic site designation. That concludes my staff report, and I'm available to answer any questions. This is a public hearing, so you would want to open this up for a public hearing after you've had any questions of me.
Right. First of all, I would just like to make a couple of comments. We now understand what Mashie Court is. That was certainly a new experience, which I think is really cool. Also, the one thing that I'm really sorry that the Avery is no longer there, because with the photos that I saw, that must have been really
Quite fascinating.
really quite fascinating. This is an amazing property. There's no question about it. So, Board, are there questions of staff that you would have?
Yes, we received documentation. I brought this up at the last, you weren't here, but at our last meeting. My feeling is it should go together. The entire property is a package. It's valuable to this community. It shouldn't be land versus buildings. It should be the entire property, the land, all of the structures on the property, the landscaping.
When you say property, though, you meaning all of the parcels that comprise the golf course?
Correct.
Not just the parcel on which the house is sited?
Right, all of them, all of them. The gatehouse, the golf shop, the carriage house, the restrooms, and the landscaping. My question also is, 2043, it seems like it's a long way off when you're my age, but it's probably right around the corner. Who will maintain all of these buildings when that comes to fruition? Will the city, is the city going to make an effort to make certain that this property is maintained the way Mr. O'Donnell had intended it to be? I mean, he intended it to be a park for the community or a golf course, and I'm certain that he wanted those buildings, those structures, to stay on this earth as long as possible.
Yeah.
So who's going to maintain that? Is the city putting together a fund for future?
I don't know what future plans they may have, but under the ordinance, if designated, then the city would be responsible for maintenance in accordance with our ordinance.
Okay, and if it's designated in 2043, will a future council, once the city has acquired the property through the lease to maintain it as a park and whatever, will it be in the city's hands? And let's say 5 years down the line, a new council comes in and says, that golf course, that park is too much. Let's use the ordinance of 50% and build some houses on there. Will the city have the option to do that, or will it be protected in perpetuity?
Pursuant to the ordinance, the city would have to adhere to the Class 1 designation and the requirements therein for Class 1 designation. Any proposed modifications would need to go through the Historic Site Preservation Board pursuant to the ordinance. In addition to any restrictions that apply relative to the historic designation, keep in mind there's also a deed restriction in place on the property, and the general plan designates it as open space. So there's a number of different things that offer protections relative to the property.
Okay, and I guess my worry is that those protections are solid and that it is in perpetuity, that this property for the next 200 years remains open.
While I can't guarantee the future actions, they're subject to processes.
Okay, is it important to use those words in a motion in perpetuity?
I don't know that it is, because again, you've got the strength of the ordinance, the general plan, and the deed restrictions.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's also important to distinguish, the city doesn't take ownership of the property in 2043. The city owns the property now. The city owns the property now.
Okay,
So it's the lease that the golf club has that ends in 2043.
okay,
And in the deed restrictions that were put on the property in 1944 by Thomas O'Donnell, it says that the area shall be used as public use. So it must always have some type of public use associated with that land, or it reverts back to the heirs of O'Donnell.
and doesn't it also state it needs to remain open space?
It says public park or public use.
So does that mean if the city in 2043 should elect to put a big museum there, since it's public use, they could build?
I don't have an answer to that question. It would have to be determined from the city's legal counsel what is determined to be a public use.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Board, other questions? Staff?
More than a question, quite a few remarks. So I would like to preface my remarks by disclosing to the board and city staff that I met board member Jan Harper from PSPF at the O'Donnell site yesterday, along with Sally Mahoney, the golf pro at the club, and member Lavoie, Bill Lavoie, that met me at the site, and we did a site visit of the entire golf course. Because that was the nomination that was brought before us from PSPF. So I'm glad to see today's memorandum. So thank you everyone who had a hand in making more of the site part of what we're reviewing today. What became abundantly clear in walking the site from one end to the other is that the whole thing needs to be a classroom site. Every inch of land, every building, every rock, every hill, every path. It's unfortunate that a developer has purchased 5 parcels above and adjacent to the site. And in our walking and discussing yesterday, it became very clear that that road that goes up to the pad and the promontory is not meant to withstand construction vehicles going back and forth, and that it's already fragile. And so that would begin to crumble and fall onto the course and begin to compromise the integrity of the overall setting. So I think it's extremely important that we not only consider the items in the memorandum today, such as the character-defining features of the course and landscape, and the carriage house, and the gate lodge, and the restroom, and the golf shop, but literally every single thing on that parcel. And I would like to note, with all due respect, that the tamarisk trees are a character-defining feature. There used to be so many more of them in Palm Springs, and they truly were everywhere, and they were the original windbreaks. So that in and of itself is a character-defining feature, and it's a landscape component of the Coachella Valley, and specifically Palm Springs, that made it unique. And those are rapidly disappearing. And they have served their purpose all these years at O'Donnell, and they were, they've always been there. And I kind of look forward to when we have a windstorm and I drive down Biloxi and I see all the tamarisk debris, because it's part of the city. It's just part of the way it's always been. So, you know, despite being a 40-plus year resident, yesterday was the very first time that I had the opportunity to walk that entire site. Everyone just goes to the golf clubhouse, or goes to Evening Under the Stars, or drives by it, but you never really get to fully appreciate the depth and breadth of Thomas O'Donnell's vision, and how expertly it was laid out for 1944, and how much that perseveres today. So thank you, Mayor, for originally asking the HSPB to consider some sort of designation on this property, and for the amendment that we have today. And thank you, PSPF, for a stellar historic resources report. And that's all I have to say at this time.
Yes, thank you so much, Jade and Linda. Dan?
I too think that it should be considered as a whole. And there's a whole other story to this, which is not really gone into here, but it's how the water in Palm Springs helped to make this happen. And I just spent a lot of time with Renee Brown on this, because she's going to do a presentation, a new presentation, about Old Las Palmas at our neighborhood meeting. And it's going to be about how the water helped Old Las Palmas develop, and how O'Donnell was instrumental in this. and like doing the reservoir at Stevens and Palm Canyon, and how that became the source of water for the golf course. So it's not only just this property, it's the story of how this is so important to the full development of Palm Springs, and it comes back to the water.
I would like to add a comment also. I think particularly important on that property is the gatehouse. That was the Committee of 25. That was their spot where they met. And that is definitely a very important part of the history of Palm Springs. And I'm sure the conversations that went on in there, we would all love to have heard. But it was a real center of, I think it was involved a little bit of politics, probably involved a little bit of setting the tone for the city. So that building also, I'm sure, that to me is a very, very crucial part of it. So I think you can see that there is a consensus within this part of the board, at least, with the four of us, that we would really like to see the whole thing designated. And I would like to reserve discussing that any further until we get over into the board comments, and we can have a discussion about that then. So do we have any other questions of staff?
Do we microfiche these reports that come to us? Are we putting them on microfiche for future years?
Well, they're digitally recorded. They're digitally maintained in our archives. So we have PDF copies of all the reports that come in. We have PDF copies of the entire packets that come to HSPB each month.
And they're preserved for many years? I mean, we don't just keep them for 24 months and
They're
then...
part of the HSPB archives that are permanent.
Great, thank you.
Okay, seeing no further questions of staff, I would like to open the public hearing. Is the applicant present? Please come to the mic, give your name and address, tell us about your project. You have 10 minutes and to present, and 2 minutes for rebuttal if desired after any other public comments. Welcome.
Thank you, Dick. My name's Stephen Keelan. I'm the Vice President of Palm Springs Preservation Foundation. I live at 1141 South Calle Marcus in Palm Springs. I just wanted to echo a lot of what you have said. And Jade, you actually brought me to tears with your eloquent remarks, and I thank you. Like you, most of us have said, I'm relieved to finally see everything being considered today after a contentious debate on why the golf house was being pulled out by the city. It's no more important or significant than any other piece of this work of environmental art. Everything that O'Donnell did there, it was meant to be part of his estate. The house is now in the National Register of Historic Places, and I think that the golf course, with its use as a historic golf course, the historic design landscape, the contributing structures are all National Register worthy. And I had the man from the National Park Service here at CPF in May, and he agreed. There are multiple golf courses on the National Register of Historic Places, and I think that this one would qualify too. It's arguably the most important, most historic piece of Old Palm Springs that tells that story. It's the last living link to the Desert Inn. It's the last enormous piece of open space right up to the mountain. He designed the golf course ingeniously to include the mountain as it comes down the foot of the mountain as part of the golf course, as a hazard. Like Jade, I believe the tamarisk trees, I wouldn't recommend planting another tamarisk tree, but that windbreak predates the golf course. And those tamarisk trees are a vital piece of the history of Palm Springs. And in one location here, I really believe that they should be retained and replaced when they die. The same with the grass. That most everything else he planted was drought tolerant or native to the Coachella Valley. He really was thinking that way. So again, PSPF, we fully support this going through as an entire site and not just the golf clubhouse. While it's an important part of this, a piece, it's just a piece. The whole thing's important.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We really appreciate this. And we very much appreciate this nomination. This is really a very, very, very important one here. And so they're all important, but this one is really, really important. So we really appreciate it. So are there any other like to speak? Please come forward and state your name, speak into the mic.
Good morning. I'm Jan Harper, and I'm on the board of the Palm Springs Preservation Foundation, and I am a trustee of the O'Donnell Club. I want to, say thank you for your consideration of this recommendation to include the entire site. We believe that, as Stephen so eloquently said and Jade said, it is very important to us that we try to move this Class 1 designation forward with the entire property.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Anyone else like to speak? Mayor Moon, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, Rob Moon, Mayor of City of Palm Springs. Hey, I'm going to ask you how to vote because that'd probably be inappropriate, but I just wanted to fill in a couple things. Thank you, Flynn, for clarifying what I had intended, not maybe what I actually said. I actually watched the tape. And so if you watch the tape, or now you can hear it straight from the horse's mouth. It was a very brief thing it was not an agenda item, but I brought it up during comments. And I spoke and I actually talked about the ancillary buildings. I talked about the golf course, but I sort of focused on the main building because I had recently done the State of the City, in which I had shown pictures of buildings that were existing when the city became a city in 1938. And when I showed, the village, the Desert Inn, and which I showed El Mirador and all these other incredible places who had been lost. And then I showed a lot of pictures of downtown Palm Springs, but two places I showed still existed. That was the Plaza Theater and the O'Donnell Club. And I commented at the time, if you looked at the picture of the O'Donnell Club, which was a postcard, it was identical to what it looks like now, except for the umbrellas in front. And I think people who know me, and I've really enjoyed working with the HSPB for a long time now. You may, if you went to the State of the City, you might remember that I commented on the fact that Bill Foster in 1978 was so outraged that someone had torn down, the owners had torn down the ticket booth at the Plaza Theater, that he went to the city council. It took him 3 years. They were slow then too. But it took him 3 years. But because of that ticket booth being torn down, in 1981, the HSPB was born. And I've really enjoyed working. This is probably my last time to be here as mayor, but I've so enjoyed working with you. In fact, I told you, I said often, my real goal was to be on this group, but I wasn't qualified, so I ran for mayor instead. But since we've been together, we've saved the Captor Plaza, we've saved the Town and Country Center. Even that Morito, the little house on Morito Place, it's got the Tudor ceiling. If you go by there, they're doing some great things with it. And we fought tooth and nail to save that one, which we did, much to Jackie Autry's chagrin. And we've done the vacant and abandoned building ordinance, which has stopped things like the demolition by neglect that Mr. Westman and others have done. And we passed the preservation ordinance, which I stomped my feet about to the city manager, and he finally put it on the agenda because I'd seen too many homes in Palm Springs ripped down without a fair hearing. So we've done a lot together. But so with my history, I would not intentionally say I just wanted to save one building, because those buildings are important. And I would disclaim, I am a member of the O'Donnell Club, have been for many years, but I am not on the board, I'm not a trustee, I'm just a social member. In fact, I don't even play golf. So the city attorney told me I don't have to recuse. But when you talk about the ancillary buildings, if you look at the pictures that were in the very good staff report, thank you, Ken, and also the pictures that were in the incredible report from the Preservation Society, the inside, pictures from the inside of the golf, of the club over there where you get your golf clubs and your bikes. It looks just like it does now today. I mean, much of it is still existent. And if you look at the Committee of 25, the Committee of 25 published a book, and if you don't have it, you should stop by there sometime and buy a copy, about the history of the Committee of 25. And that building was built in 1927. In fact, if I can read a little, I hate to read things to you, but the founders of that Committee of 25 in 1948 were the titans of industry who lived in Palm Springs. People like the President of the Bank of America, leaders in aviation, senators, congressmen, all sorts of people who built this place. But what I wanted to read to you, here's why I hate use electronic. Here it is. Completed in 1927, the Petite building was designed by William Charles Tanner, who had done O'Donnell's home nestled on the hillside overlooking Palm Springs, as well at the Desert Inn's 1920s revamp. So he worked on the Desert Inn. Through a few additions have been tacked on, and an interior design took place in the 1960s by none other than the famed desert designer Arthur Elrod. So if you go in that building, which hopefully, if you haven't been in there, you will, that interior is so classic Arthur Elrod, and it has not been touched. I think the furniture is still the same. It's an incredible place. And also, if you look at the people who have been there, it says not long after the club was founded in 1948, an enviable speaker series was launched, which we still have 71 years later. Since its inception, the club has presented presidents, military leaders, business professionals, astronauts, journalists, celebrities, and athletes, such as President Dwight D. Eisenhower, not that he was an athlete, but President Dwight D. Eisenhower, General Jimmy Doolittle, Walter Cronkite, Dinah Shore, and many other really important people who've been speakers in that building. So that building in itself is so important. Even the bathroom from 1930, I mean, think of how many famous people have used that facility. So it would make no sense for us not to look at the whole thing. And when I watched the video, again, as I said, I probably wasn't clear enough, but I did talk about the entire thing. And I just wish I had not made this more clear to staff earlier, or the staff didn't ask me about it right afterwards. But I want to make sure you know that my intent from the very beginning was to make the whole thing in total, because it was built at that time. And what else do we have in the city that is of that age and represents the history and architecture and the culture of Palm Springs? So I think that's all I wanted to mention. But again, thank you for all the work you've done since 1981, and also for working. I've enjoyed working so much with all of you individually and as a group for the last 4 years. So please push this on, because my one wish is to vote on this while I'm still able to vote.
We're scheduling this for the October 23rd City Council meeting.
Okay, let's make sure it happens, Flynn. But thank you.
Thank you. You always bring sunshine into the room. Thanks for coming.
Mr. Chair,
Moonshine?
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Mayor Moon, I'd like to personally thank you for all you and this council have done to help retain
Right.
the history of Palm Springs and the open space. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if people recall or not, but the first night we were seated 4 years ago, we voted the Class 1 designation on Pawtucket Plaza, which
Yes.
is now Captor Plaza, and Hugh Captor was there, and I actually went out into the audience and congratulated him. But if you may not recall or even know, but Steve Punier and the previous council, pressed by Steve, had approved for that to be torn down and to build 110 condos on it, spaced 5 feet apart and 10 feet higher than code allowed, and all the way to the sidewalk.
Yeah.
It would have been a travesty. And also, his council had also approved ripping down the Town and Country Center to put a road through there and build 60-foot high office buildings in there. So our council turned around a lot of stuff. We fixed a lot of, there's still some stuff broken, but we fixed a lot, particularly in historic preservation. I've taken way over my 3 minutes. Okay.
And
Thank you.
speaking of the original formation of the HSPB, I was at the library subcommittee meeting last night for the whether the library the options they were considering, and Kitty was there, and she was the first member of the HSPB board. So it's wonderful to have this kind of recognition and see where we started and where we are today. Thank you so much. Yes, sir.
Tough act to follow. Good morning. I'm Charles Brobeck. I'm a Palm Springs resident and a member of the board of directors of the O'Donnell Golf Club. I'm just here to ratify the comments said before me and give wholehearted support from the board of directors and the members of the club to have this as a designated historical property entirety. So thank you very much for your time. I don't want to belabor anymore. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate it. Anyone else that would like to speak? Okay. Oh, Jade?
Yeah, I have something else to add.
Mr.
Yesterday
Chair,
I had-
Mr. Chair?
I have to close the public comments
Yeah.
first, please, or the public hearing. Okay. Seeing none, I will close the public hearing. So the action is now with the board. So your comments and questions, please.
Okay, thank you. I had asked city staff yesterday to provide us with an aerial view of the site with the 500-foot perimeter line encircling the golf house, which was in the context of yesterday before we had this memorandum. But if that image is available, it would be nice if we could see that, because I think it really pertains to the discussion of the setting. Is that possible to see?
Sorry, we don't have that available to put up on the screen, but
Okay.
we can provide that on future nominations as well.
Okay, great. And just one other thing. With respect to city staff and the staff report, I just wanted to note that on page 37 of the Historic Resources Report regarding the third hole restroom, they did in fact say that the original design had terracotta barrel tile. So it is recommended that when the roof needs to be replaced, original style tiles are used. So they made note of the fact that they are not the original design, but they do need to be changed in the future. So that was there. But thank you, city staff, for additionally pointing that out. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Board, any other comments? Seeing none. We have a motion.
I move that we recommend to the city council the designation of the O'Donnell Golf Course, all of the structures on the property, the landscaping to the city council for historic designation, class 1 designation.
Thank you. We have a first, we have,
May I just ask for clarification? Are you then recommending what's in the subsequent material from today, along with the recommendation in the staff report?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I would like to amend that motion.
okay.
So, I think I have a question though before I do that. There is this whole question mark or issue of the promontory. And I think it's really unfortunate that not all 7 members of our board have done a proper site visit like I was able to do yesterday with Bill LeBois. That is so crucial to understanding the absolutely beautiful setting that we have there and how much the promontory relate to the golf course. And I know that that nomination has come before us, but no decision had been made yet. So I guess my question is, that is privately owned and that can't be included. To what point going up the hillside can we include in this nomination for designation?
Only those parcels which comprise the golf course.
Okay, so how far up does that go?
If you look at the vicinity map, let me just pull this up a second. If you go to the back end of the staff report, the first page in your application after my staff report is the vicinity map,
Okay,
okay? So the parcels that you're talking about that are privately owned are these.
okay,
Those would not be part of this nomination.
okay. Which is why I'd asked for an aerial view to be displayed on the screen today, and I realized that wasn't possible. But in the future, when we're considering large sites like this, I think it's extremely crucial. We have an aerial map right there, on the wall, which is quite old and hard to see. But, it's such an enormous task before us today because this hillside was all part of the O'Donnell vision. The house, the O'Donnell House, the Hotel de Theater, the promontory, the hillside, the landscape. It's all integral to the living, breathing beauty of that site. That is so extremely important, and no one's talking about it. And it's really upsetting to me. I feel like we're jumping the gun here, and I know that the mayor really wants this done before November. But, we're missing 3 of our board members today, and this is the kind of thing that seems to deserve a study session, much like the Racket Club. And I feel like this is the single most important historic site in the entire Coachella Valley. And it's not getting the time or the attention or the input that it really deserves. And I don't want us to just say, oh yeah, let's make a motion and vote on everything in the memorandum when I know that won't encapsulate everything that truly needs to be a Class 1 status. Because, in the future, a lot of things could happen with the promontory and the road, and any development there will have a cumulative impact on the golf course and will begin to ruin the beauty. Sally Mahoney has been there for 27 years plus, longer than O'Donnell was ever there. And she and I had some lovely discussion yesterday about, the beauty of the place and how any development up there on the promontory will have a severe negative impact. And all of the members feel the same way. So why isn't there a bigger discussion here? Why are we rushing to judgment on this?
Member Nelson, when applications come in, it's required that they be submitted under the authority of the owner. In the case of the surrounding parcels on any of the sites that you consider, whether it be a significant commercial building downtown or perhaps a residential building in a neighborhood like Old Las Palmas, you're not only looking at the site, but you are looking at context. And I think context is what you're driving at. There's a certain limit to which the HSPB can consider these applications, and I'm not trying to limit your scope or understanding of it because your point is understood. But there is a limit to that which we can actually, as a city, consider. And it's not within the purview of the board to go into sites that are not owned by the city, which have not had owner support for a potential nomination, to bring those in. We can certainly talk about the integrity and the setting, which I think you guys have aptly targeted. And I think that's important if you want to emphasize that in your resolution, that the issue of context is a vital one. As Director Fagg mentioned, we do have a previous pending nomination on the promontory. I've been working with the applicant to try to bring, I'm sorry, not with the applicant, with the owner, because that particular nomination was brought in without owner support. So until I can try to get owner support on the nomination on the promontory, I've been trying to hold it back. I've been working with them to help them understand, allay some of their fears and concerns, so that it would be wonderful if we could bring that application forward to City Council with owner support. I don't have that right now, but I am trying to work on that. So I offer that simply to try to understand what is the limit to which the board has ability to consider that area which you talk about in terms of setting, which are some of those things beyond the site, but the limitations around which the city has to affect or include in a nomination those kinds of factors. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And if I may add, one thing I brought up yesterday is that if any place in the city qualifies as a historic district, it would be this golf course and the adjacent Thomas O'Donnell House, which is on the National Register. And rather than having the golf course with the 500-foot perimeter line, we should be looking at the entire APN, or the entire parcel, then draw a 500-foot line around that. And then that gives you the true sense of the setting and what you're trying to preserve, because that is one of those sites where it's not just what's behind the tamarisk tree, it's what's happening on Bellardo, it's what's happening on Alejo, it's what's happening in the museum parking lot, and it's what's happening up on the hill that affects this site. It's all so incredibly important. So I would like to amend the motion that was made by Ms. Dixon to include every single parcel and include all of the land up to the property line that is owned by the owner of the promontory. So basically, everything that comprises the current golf course as outlined in the Historic Resources Report by PSPF. Every tree, seriously, I'm not just being facetious here, it's extremely important. So that's my amendment, and I hope that's clear.
Ms. Dixon.
As the maker of the motion, I'm not quite sure I understand.
I believe that Board Member Nelson is identifying that all of the parcels that comprise the
Okay,
golf
where can
course
we- Where can we see that?
on page 22 of the Historic Resource nomination. So all of the parcels that comprise the golf course would be included in the designation.
So that way, Linda, in the future, when something happens on that property, it will come before this board.
Okay, so $32, $30, $702, $688, $689.
Yes, those are all comprising the course.
What about Stevens Road?
No, we would not be able to include that.
Okay, so you're talking about this particular
Exactly,
outline,
yes, that one.
Up to Bellardo, all the way around, and then this piece, is this that parking space? Is 32 the parking space we parked at when we walked up to Inspiration Point?
I'll ask Mr. Lyon to
It
respond to
would,
that.
it would not include the parking area that leads up to Inspiration Point. That's a separate privately owned parcel.
Question. The access road to the promontory, I know there's some question as to what part of that the city owns and what part the owner of the property owns. My understanding was that there's a small portion of that road that's owned by the golf course or by the city. Can you clarify that?
From my review of the parcels, I'm not aware of parcels that are part of that roadway to the promontory that are owned by the city.
Can you repeat that, please?
I'm not aware of any portion of the access road to the promontory that are owned by the city.
Okay, maybe there's someone in the audience who might have greater contribution to that? No? Okay, so it's all privately owned, the entire road?
Yes.
Okay,
As far as we know, it's privately owned.
okay.
I think that, I tried to take on the vicinity map and crosshatch that which is the area that comprises the total golf course, including this narrow strip along Alejo on which the Committee of 25 building or the gatehouse is located, all the way over to Bellardo, and all the way down to where the Museum Way and Bellardo areas connect. So it's all of this.
So all of the city-owned parcels.
Yes.
So ours isn't striped like yours is?
I just striped that.
Oh, I see.
So that you would
Okay.
understand, when you look at those parcel boundaries, and I'll pass this around if it would
Okay.
help, that you can understand what the parcels are that the city actually owns.
That's a good idea.
Thank you, Ken. This is very helpful. All right, so everything that you filled in here, Ken, is part of the O'Donnell Golf Course property and all the parcels as we know it.
Yes, if you were to look at the title, it says the City of Palm Springs.
Okay, great. So that would be what I would like to see in my amended motion for the designation. We'll pass that around.
So all of these are not included. Okay, the maker of the motion accepts the amendment.
One more thing. The
Are
driveway.
you further amending?
I'm sorry, what?
Are you further amending?
I am further amending.
Oh, okay.
One more thing, question for staff. The access point from the museum parking lot and that gate and driveway, is that part of this as well?
You're going to have to hand me back my vicinity map for me to answer that.
The maintenance yard next to the Wildwood Cemetery, is that what you're looking at?
No, he's talking about
Yeah.
into the
Yes,
parking.
that would be part of the area owned by the city.
Okay, great.
That's the building on which the carriage house is located.
Okay, great, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so thank you for that clarification, that's important. So my amendment still stands,
And I-
As stated.
yes.
Ms. Dixon, I have one thing I would like to add. I don't want to make this a condition, but when future capital improvements are being considered, I would like to at least have as far as the motion is concerned, that the wood panels that are now painted, that they be restored back to the original wood. Not a condition, but just as a note
Recommendation.
of request. Pardon?
Recommendation.
A recommendation, yes. So I would like to add that to the motion.
It's fine with the maker of the motion.
So just to go along those lines, it is my understanding that as a city-owned building, that the interior would also be under
Yes,
HSPB purview, is that correct?
right.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so our motion should include the entirety of the interior of the buildings and the exterior of the buildings.
It's,
I would only qualify that you want to make sure that you're not including areas like the kitchens and everything else that have already lost their integrity. There are portions of the interiors of these buildings that would not normally come before the board because they no longer exist as they did during the period of significance. So what you might want to do on this is those areas within the building that are recognized as part of the original building, such as the living room, the study, the sunroom. I don't know if you want to include the veranda because the veranda is significantly modified from what it was during the period of significance, but that's your prerogative.
Okay, so my one further amendment is that the nomination would include everything except the non-contributing features as outlined in the current memorandum, but making sure that the ficus trees do remain.
And the tamarisk
Do
trees.
you mean the tamarisk or the ficus?
The tamarisk trees.
I'm sorry, the tamarisk trees. And then,
That's part of the landscape. I said all of the landscaping.
yes. The only other thing, though, that I've just realized I didn't mention was the later edition by Clark and Frey and the E. Stewart Williams edition in 48 and 67. Even though those are not considered original contributing features, I think it's important that they remain there because they've been part of the language of the site for so long now.
This is something then that the board needs to determine whether you're going to take something that is not done during the period of significance and move it into contributing. That's inconsistent with the way you would normally look at a component.
How do we feel about that? Should, in the case of the Gate Lodge, like in the future, if somebody wanted to take away the Clark and Frey or the E. Stewart Williams or the Chiapi edition,
Right.
would we support that? Or does the Committee of 25 require those editions? Because, you know, they've had them now since 48 and 67 and 91.
Keep in mind, they're also a tenant. They're not the owner.
I'm sorry?
They are the tenant, not the owner.
Okay. Okay. But as a future use, if this becomes a public benefit or a park or a place for the public to use, it would seem to me that it would make sense to have more square footage or buildings that are usable than taking them away. So I don't know that of all the non-contributing features, those are the only ones that I have a question on the ones at the Gate Lodge. Even though they're not original, maybe they should be included in the designation.
I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Keelan, has his hand raised to come up, and ask him to please come up.
Jade, I struggled with that a little bit too, but those later additions were really just kitchens and sort of service areas. They weren't significant architecture. And if at some point when the Committee of 25 is no longer a tenant and the city may want to restore the Gate Lodge, that those buildings, those small additions and the Chiaffi addition take away from the original Tanner design. So if that were to be repurposed into something else and to be restored as the original Gate Lodge, I wouldn't want to have those really little service areas hinder anything like that, which is why I had made them non-contributing.
Right.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
I completely agree
Thank you.
now.
It really helps.
Can you read the motion back to us the best you can, please?
I will do the best I can. So you have recommended that the city council consider Class 1 designation of the golf house as well as the entire set of structures and land area that comprise the golf course in terms of those parcels that are owned by the city of Palm Springs, including the reference to the October 8th memo from Director Fagg identifying the various character-defining features and non-contributing features of all of those components. That the motion is amended to include all the parcels as mentioned, and that there is a recommendation included in the recommendation of City Council that the interior wood ceilings in the golf house be restored in any future capital improvement project that's considered there, that the tamarisk trees be included within the comprehensive listing of the landscaping, that the later additions to the gatehouse by Clark and Frey and Stuart Williams would not be included as contributing elements.
Does that sound
Okay,
good?
is that acceptable? Okay.
Yes.
We have a first, we have a second.
Who's the second?
Pardon?
I didn't hear a second.
No, that's what I'm saying. I'm asking,
Oh,
do we have a
did he-
second?
did- Oh, okay, thank you.
Have a second?
Yeah, I seconded
second it with
and
the
amended.
Good. So we
Thank
have a
you.
first by Member Dixon and a second by Member Nelson. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion happily carries 4-0.
Thank you.
Mr.
This has been a
Chair,
great one. We really, really appreciate this. Yeah, thank you so much.
as I had indicated to the mayor, we are scheduling this for a public hearing at the October 23rd City Council meeting. And then secondly, one of the things that I identified in small print at the bottom of the memo is I think it would be helpful if we did a landscape survey of the property so that we have the placement of all the
Yeah,
tree
great
groupings.
idea.
That would augment the information that we have in the report, and I think it would be helpful to future boards as well as staff to understand the placement of all the landscape materials.
I have a question of
Yes,
staff.
please.
I'm curious, why was there not site visits for the board?
There was attempted effort to make site visits on all of the items on your public hearings today. We had some difficulties making some of those. We also had some issues with some emergency absences of staff that we were not able to complete those. So our apologies for that.
Okay, in the future, I mean, I wasn't able to go, but fortunately, I've seen the golf course. But I think it's really important that the HSPB see the sites that are coming before us.
We absolutely agree.
Thank you.
Good. So we are ready to move on to item 2B. It's an application by the Marito Manor Community Association for Historic District designation of Marito Manor located at 197 West Marito Place. May I have a staff report, please?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an application that's been brought in by the Marino Manor Condominium Association. The proposed district would be comprised of the 10 dwelling units that are arranged in 5 buildings and the common areas. The district would encompass an area of approximately 1 area in size, and the report was prepared by homeowner Doug Macbeth of the Marino Manor Homeowners Association. The significance of this particular project is that it was designed in 1960 by architect Barry Burkus and what has become known as the mid-century modern or desert modern architectural style. The report asserts that the 5 buildings in the common area that comprise Marino Manor qualify as a historic district because they are a noteworthy example of the type of multifamily development that became popular in Palm Springs following World War II. They exemplify the distinctive characteristics of mid-century modern or desert modern. They present the work of architect Barry Burkus, whose innovative residential work has been recognized nationally. And the proposed district represents a distinctive entity, the individual parts of which, especially the common areas, are not necessarily significant or distinctive. And I'm referencing those back to the actual criteria that you consider when you're looking at these kinds of applications. On page 2 of your staff report, it goes into a bit of the background on this. As you know from reviewing some of the other past nominations, following World War II, Palm Springs saw tremendous growth. I'll refer you to the bottom of page 2 and look at the absolute numbers of population. 1940, there were 3,400 registered residents here. By 1950, that had doubled to 7,600. By 1956, it had increased to 12,000. That degree of population increase was driving the development of these multifamily projects. It was also a time following World War II, beginning in 1960, when the new condominium form of land ownership had been approved. And we saw the first of these apparently in Utah, but Palm Springs was one of the first cities in California to allow that type of land ownership to be established. The properties that are being considered in this nomination are shown on page 5. There you see the various individual addresses and the units as they're arranged in the various configuration in the open space in the middle, as well as a swimming pool. Excuse me. Because this is a historic district, this is evaluated slightly differently from the way that you would normally evaluate a site. So beginning on page 4, I've identified those requirements that are submitted as part of this application. They've identified the photographs of the site, the architect, the dates and methods of construction, the period of significance identified as that post-World War II period, 1945 to 1969. The exhibit on page 5 of your staff report lists the various buildings, APNs, and units, and the owners that were present at the time of this application. You'll see in the appendix of your application that almost all of the property owners at the time of this submittal were in support of the nomination, and I had conversations with their association by teleconference this past week, in which they are all still, the ones that we spoke with at that time are still in support of it. They've identified the distinctive characteristics. I'm now reading on the top of page 6, and they've provided the biography of where their information has been provided by. The one thing I want to point out to you as I get into some more of the detail on this, the information that's in the staff report, once I conclude this, you will see we believe that there's information here that qualifies this as a historic district. One of the requirements of a historic district application as part of our new ordinance is the development of design guidelines. In this particular case, what they provided to us was their architectural standards from their CC&Rs. It's a good place to start. Again, it's their architectural guidelines and parameters from their CC&Rs. It does not necessarily represent a set of design standards for a historic district. So what I'm recommending when you get into the final recommendations of staff on this application is that we do recommend that your action would be to recommend historic district nomination for this project. However, between now and the timing of the public hearing of the City Council, I've asked the applicant to work with me on the development of a fair set of concise design guidelines that are applicable to this potential historic district, and they have agreed to do so. Beginning on page 9 of your staff report, again, we've talked about the defining characteristics. the contributing resources and the non-contributing resources. In terms of non-contributing, we've identified the landscape in the common areas as non-contributing. The angular swimming pool, we've identified as a defining characteristic, with the caveat that the homeowners association be allowed to modify that as necessary for capital improvements, improvements, repairs, and any code-required updates that they may have to do. On page 10 of your staff report, then, I've identified some of the non-contributing. I want to point out at Unit 660, we've made some special notation, and there's also notation in the Historic Resources report. This unit does have an unpermitted room addition, and it has a mural that was painted on the walls without approval by their HOA. So we've identified those pieces as non-contributing. Now, this can be handled in a couple of different ways. This unit, aside from this addition, in staff's opinion, qualifies as a contributing site or a contributing element within the historic district. The addition, we recommend not be a contributing element. There are other ways you can look at this. You can say that Unit 660, because of this non-permitted addition, has been so damaged that it no longer contributes. That's not staff's recommendation, but I want you to understand that is an option before you. When you have a resource that's within a historic district where most of it still retains its characteristics that contribute, it can be considered a contributing element. If that resource or site or building had been so terribly materially impaired that it no longer reflects or represents the period of significance, then you might want to say that item is not a contributing feature to the resource. Do you understand the difference? Do you want me to further explain that? Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I do understand that. However, my question is, if something is identified as a non-contributing structure within a historic district, at some point in the future, if a future board was to hear a nomination on that non-contributing piece, would they hear it or not? Or what would happen? That I'm kind of murky about the future of that non-contributing piece.
In this particular case, the owner is seeking to legalize the addition. So they've been approached by the city, they've been approached by their board as long ago as apparently the 80s. So this addition has been in place for a pretty good long time. But sometime in the 80s, there was a note in the building permit files that noted that this thing has been identified as a non-permitted addition. My understanding in speaking with the people in the building department and with Doug Macbeth from the Homeowners Association, the owner's desire is to legalize that. He would like to retain the non-permitted addition and get it legalized. Now, when you look at the photographs of this that are in the Historic Resources report, you'll see what's really been done is if you look at the folded plate portion of this particular unit, it's taken that portion of it and extended it into what was previously their patio. Okay? So it isn't as though you're looking at a building that has a particular architectural style and somebody has put an addition onto it that completely is different. It's an addition that was done harmoniously with the architectural style of that unit. That's why we did not disqualify it. We saw it as still being contributing. The unit still contributes to the understanding of the significance of this particular group of buildings in this particular area.
One more clarification. So if we were to say that it was non-contributing and he wanted to legalize the unpermitted part, could he do so?
Well, certainly he could do so and legalize the structure, but if you determine through your analysis of it and based on your findings that it doesn't qualify, his legalizing the addition doesn't change its status as non-contributing.
Okay, great, thank you.
So in completing just my report here, I want to just finish the discussion. Those areas that are contributing, again, are documented on the bottom of page 9 and the top of page 10. They have noted that and I'm going to go now into the non-contributing discussion just briefly. Their parking areas have had precast pavers added to them, which is a nice enhancement, but it's not the way that it was at the time of the period of significance. So we've said that even though they've done those nice precast pavers, they are not contributing. They're not part of the original project. The mural, in the addition, we've already spoken about. Common area landscape. Again, we look at this in terms of open space, but we try to give flexibility to these homeowners associations as it comes to drought-tolerant landscaping and that kind of thing, so that they have some flexibility moving forward. There's also a disparate amount of screen doors and things like that that have been added to the project. They have taken some areas where there had been carports originally. Sometime over the past 50, 60 years, some of those carports have been enclosed. And through the good shepherdship of this particular HOA, they've now had those enclosures removed. So the carports have basically been returned to carports. They had been carports originally. A couple of them got enclosed as garages. Those garage enclosures have been removed. So now the carports are back to the way they were originally. And then there's minor things, a group of mailboxes, some screen block that was not original on the west carport, and then some areas of service-mounted conduit and gutters and downspouts and irrigation piping that we kind of typically see when we're looking at nominations of this sort, where you've got historic district buildings that are 50, 60, 70 years old. There's ultimately an amount of clutter, and we've seen this on every building that you guys have considered when it comes to historic district. Our recommendations when we work with these homeowners is, if you're doing capital improvements, work to the best of your ability to pull that stuff off and conceal it. So that's what that's about. So in conclusion, we are recommending that this particular historic district does have the credentials enough to qualify. It's qualified under criteria 3, 4, 5, and 6 under your ordinance. And that concludes my staff report. I think the applicant is in the audience. Do we have somebody? Yes, sir, we do.
Right.
Again, Mr. Chair, that concludes my staff report. If you have any questions of me, I'll answer them, and then this is a public hearing.
First, I would like to ask, if you would, just one moment, any questions, other questions from the board of the staff,
I do.
please.
Ken, just so I'm clear, the historic district, the designated, the guidelines that you're going to be working on, what exactly will those be?
When you have a historic district, the code requires, our new ordinance requires, the old one did not, that there be guidelines that help guide the development of future development or changes within that historic district. These condominium associations are unique as historic districts because you're normally seeing a group of buildings that were all built at the same time, all by the same developer. So design guidelines are a little more simplistic. But when you look at the design guidelines, for example, for the Las Palmas Business Historic District, you're trying to take into account what is the character. In the case of a commercial district, what is the alignment of the front of the buildings? Should they retain that edge along the sidewalk so that there is a definable edge for shopping and strolling along that particular area? Those are the kind of things that get identified in a set of design guidelines, so that if a new building does get introduced into that historic district, it's done in a way that is harmonious to the defining characteristics of the district and contribute to its overall historic significance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. So when condominium developments come in front of us, they will be considered historic districts.
That's correct.
Okay, and so each condominium association that comes before us will need to work with you on a set of guidelines for their particular association.
They need to work with me or someone to help them pull together design guidelines, yes.
And
the only caveat or asterisk I would put on that statement is, these are condominium associations which are comprised of multiple buildings and multiple APNs.
okay,
In the same way that you would think of a traditional historic district, you have multiple parcels, you have multiple structures, you have multiple APNs. if you were to look at a building, and I believe we had one here that was, trying to remember, and somebody may be able to correct me, the Desert Star, I think was done as one building. I think we did that as a site,
We did.
even though there are multiple units, but it's a building. And that's the distinction that we made. The city has condominium complexes that are arranged in different ways legally. Some condominium complexes are a single lot condominium. Others have the individual parcels defined on the land. We just have to look at these on a case-by-case basis and make the appropriate determination whether it fits best as a district or fits best as a site. The ones that we've been seeing so far have been the ones I described. Multiple parcels, multiple buildings, multiple APNs. It fits as a district.
And those become part of their CCNRs?
No, their CCNRs would have been established back when they were established as a condominium. But the qualifications now and the requirements in our ordinance for historic districts is that you must have this identification of the period of significance, the area that's within the district, those that are contributing and non-contributing, and the design guidelines. So when you look at some of the earlier ones that the boards, previous boards have nominated and the council has approved of, such as Pompeii de las Palmas, Royal Hawaiian, Sandcliff, Park Imperial South, these all were nominated and approved as districts prior to our current ordinance. We don't have design guidelines on those. Our very first historic district, which is the Las Palmas Business Historic District, does have a set of design guidelines, and those guidelines are used when new development is considered in that historic district.
Thank you, that was very helpful.
Can there be a, let's call it a checklist of guidelines that we could have and that would be good for any other condominium that's thinking about, considering, so they can take a look at it in advance? I think it would be very, very helpful to all the communities. We could do that.
The Secretary of the Interior does have a set of bulletins and guidelines for the help groups looking at historic district guidelines for how to begin to put those together. So we will provide those for these applicants as a manner of helping them with development of their own design guidelines.
And could we have a copy as the board as well?
Sure.
Good. I think these would be very, very important because I see a movement, which I'm very happy about, with various condo associations coming to us for historic district
So you mean a
designation.
copy of that when the staff sends us a report? To get a copy of that with the report?
I can provide
What
you
the
with a copy
guidelines.
of the Secretary of the Interior bulletin that helps provide some guidance for people considering historic districts for
Right.
the assembly of their design guidelines.
What those guidelines would be.
Yeah.
Because I think it'd
agree.
also be helpful for condominiums who are considering to start right away. They see, I think it would be a great guideline
Right.
checklist
Right.
to have.
And we could have delayed this, but we've got a lot of applications that have been coming in. Rather than hold them back, we decided to bring them forward to you today, but that as a condition of your action, they would be required to put together a set of concise design guidelines.
Okay, that's great news. Okay. Mr. Nelson.
So the first one, with regard to the sidewalk that borders the site of the Marito Manor complex, do we know if that's original from the time it was constructed?
Are you talking about the perimeter public sidewalk?
Correct.
If it's the public sidewalk, that would be in the public right-of-way, and that would not be considered.
Okay, but I'm not sure if that was built as part of the complex. Regardless of whether it's public or city-owned, my question is, was it built at the time of the complex being built? Because it's part of the integrity of the setting.
I can't answer that question. You might want to ask that question when the applicant comes forward.
Okay, great, thank you. A couple other things. So in the historic resources report for the application, it does say that it reflects or exemplifies a particular period of national, state, or local history, which the staff report does not agree with. So just for the record, I just want to say that Barry Burkus, the architect of Marino Manor, was in fact a person of national significance. And if you look at the Historical Resources Report on page 61, it does say in the fourth paragraph of his obituary that he had a career that spanned nearly 6 decades and built a portfolio of 600,000 dwellings encompassing 10,000 designs and developments across the United States, including Playa Vista in LA, Harbor View in Newport Beach, Turtle Rock Highlands, and Woodbridge Landing in Irvine, and Park Imperial South in Palm Springs. And there were others throughout the country that he worked on. So that does make Burkus a person of national significance. So therefore, in my opinion, the property would qualify somewhat under Criterion 1. So I just wanted to state that opinion for the record.
Mr. Nelson, Criterion 1 is about significant events. With reference to...
I'm sorry, I meant Criterion 2.
Well,
My
with-
apologies.
With reference to persons of significance, the report did not assert that there were any persons of significance associated with this. However, Criterion 3, which is the period of significance, and the association with Barry Burkus is identified as qualifying. So I'm not sure I'm understanding your question.
Okay. The way I read the Historic Resources Report was that the property reflects or exemplifies a period of national, state, or local history.
And the staff report agrees with
What I
that.
really meant to say was that it's identified with a person of significance either on the local or national level, which Barry Burkus is.
But the report does not assert that, and Barry Burkus is identified under the architect and designer of significance.
Okay.
Does that cover it
Yeah,
okay?
Okay, thank you. One more thing. There's a listing of all the homeowners on page 52 of the report, and Unit 189 is missing, and there's no homeowner name on that line. Do we know why?
I believe the applicant will clarify it. I think they have an absentee
Okay.
owner in that particular case. They did correspond with all of the owners. They did do outreach to all of the owners.
Okay.
That particular owner has been apparently non-responsive, but I will let the applicant clarify that for you.
Great, thank you.
I have just a couple of comments. On the resolution, which would be on, that would be following page 12. Let's see, these pages don't have numbers. Attachment 2,
Attachment
draft resolution, and just go over to the first page where it says resolution. Item number C. This is a small detail. Site visits were in October. I don't know if that's that important to mention or not, but I thought I would.
I
just for the
concur with
record,
that.
make mention of that. Also, under the same thing, if you go over into the staff report, under the architectural guidelines, gosh, I'm trying
Can
to
you give me a page?
see how I can give you a page. There's no page number. It's one of those things that's an addition after all the CCRs. If you go past the CCRs, it says from April 4, 2016 email at the top. And they list 15 different
Towards the back.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about.
15 items. There's one thing that stood out to me that, unless I missed it, there's not mentioned in that there's no reference to sliding patio doors as far as guidelines are concerned.
Again, it's some of the shortcomings like that that's our reason for making a recommendation for a condition of approval that a concise set of guidelines be
Right.
developed.
Okay, very good. Okay, thank you. Any other staff comments? Or any other comments of staff, rather? Questions of staff? Okay, seeing none. I believe the applicant is present, so if you would please,
Open the public hearing.
pardon?
You formally open the public hearing.
Oh, I guess I did open the public hearing. Yes, sorry, it is now time for the public hearing. If the applicant would please come forward and state your name. You have 10 minutes to present and 2 minutes for rebuttal, if desired, after any public comments.
Okay.
So welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Doug Macbeth. I live at 181 West Morito Place. I'm the author of the nomination, resident re-runner, and also the president of the HOA. And it's great to be here at this point. This has been a 3-year process for me getting this written. I've had lots of support, encouragement along the way, and guidance. I want to thank Ken Lyon, also Ron and Barbara Marshall with PSPF, and my neighbor Kim Schmidt, who's here today as well. So I appreciate all the input that I've gotten along the way. I didn't really have any prepared comments other than, I just really appreciate all of your consideration for this nomination and your support. And I appreciate the members who came out and toured this last week. I think we had 3 visitors over 2 site visits. And I know, Jade, you had a question about 189. That is an absentee homeowner who's not involved at all with the HOA. The way I understand it is the family acquired that unit in the mid-1970s, and it's been kind of passed through the generations. It's now with the granddaughter who lives in New Jersey, and she does not respond to any correspondence that we send out, does not attend any of the HOA meetings, and has a tenant in there right now, so she's not involved. But the 9 out of 10 units supported the historic district pursuing status of the historic district. So, sure. We also talked about 660 with that room addition, and when I bought my unit, there were 2 unpermitted room additions, and I restored that unit. And our hope is, even if this unit is to be permitted by the city, I don't even know if it's permittable. I don't know if it's up to code, and the owner is working with the code compliance officer of the city right now. But even if it is permitted, our hope is that someday someone will tear that down and restore the patio because it is a non-defining characteristic and does not fit in with the architecture out there. The sidewalk, we are in Old Las Palmas, and there are not many sidewalks out there. I don't know what was there in 1961. I know you do your walking tours through that area, and, it's not part of our complex. They're city sidewalks, I believe. I don't believe we've never had to do anything with the sidewalk, so I don't know when those were installed.
Well, it's interesting because, those are the only sidewalks in North Palmas, other than what's around Trio, but that's Palm Canyon Drive frontage. So it feels to me like it was part of the original design.
It could be.
So I can't imagine that property without the sidewalk.
Yeah, we are close to North Palm Canyon, just off West Morito Place, and so those sidewalks kind of tie into that area across from Trio, and then as you head into Old Las Palmas, the sidewalks disappear. But that does continue around the corner on North Bellardo Road, and then I believe they end there as well.
They also continue on Corto, which is right behind Palm Canyon, and it goes over to Vereda Sewer. There are sidewalks along there.
Okay.
And there are sidewalks also next to the Wyndham. And those actually, there was something before the city council for the twist that was being redone that they were going to require additional sidewalks put on Corto. So it's really hard to know when this is or not because it's very piecemeal. It's even piecemeal today with what's going on. Yes, Ken.
I just want to briefly address the question of the sidewalks in general. The city engineering department, when there are new developments, does require that sidewalks be installed in curb and gutter. In the case of Las Palmas and many of the hillside areas, you have what are referred to as rural street profiles, meaning there is no curb and gutter and there is no sidewalk. That doesn't stop the city's requirement that sidewalks be installed. But where we have conditions where most of the street does not have sidewalks, then the city engineering department allows that developer to, quote unquote, defer to covenant, unquote, the installation of those sidewalks. What that means in common language is that when the city determines that the sidewalks, curb and gutter in any particular street or neighborhood needs to go in, it would be done so as a complete project, so that we don't wind up with this gap, strange condition where each new sidewalk with a new development occurs and then it stops at the property line. So new development that occurs in places like Old Las Palmas, Araby, the hillside areas, would have sidewalks, curb and gutter deferred to covenant. That's what I suspect is probably occurring in Old Las Palmas and probably what had occurred when this thing was built. When this thing was built, they probably put the sidewalks in, but more recently, the city engineering department has been willing to defer to covenant because the neighbors in those particular areas like their rural profile and they like the condition in which they don't have curb, gutter, and sidewalk.
Thank you. Oh, we're learning all sorts of things today. Thank you. Mashy,
Yeah.
sidewalks. That's
Defer to
good.
covenant.
Okay.
I don't have
Anything
anything
else?
else unless you have any
Okay.
other questions. Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. Yeah, I know how much work that went
you.
into doing this. I mentioned to you before. We really appreciate it and your interest in the designation. So are there other public comments from the audience? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing. The action is now with the board. So your comments and questions, please.
I think what you're doing is great. I mean, the work that they've put into this and the improvements that have been made really are beautiful. And I had been through some of these units when it was on a previous house tour. And I was very impressed with it then when one of the units was for sale, actually. Louise Hampton was having open houses the same day as the house tour. So she did get a lot of traffic through there. But the way that, especially the way that the glass had been put around the pool where it didn't obstruct your view, and the sighting of it, and then your ideas of cleaning this up and trying to bring it back closer to what it was originally. I think one of the main things that I would encourage would be to see some sort of enclosures on the HVAC units and something to cover the ductwork. And actually, what Todd Hayes did at his house actually would be a good example of something that would, to me, would be very appropriate for that. Otherwise, I think it's a real gem, and I think it's wonderful to have in Old Las Palmas.
Mr. Nelson.
I would like to make a motion that we,
I have a comment then too.
oh,
I'm
sorry,
I
okay.
think you were ready.
Come back to me.
Right. I would just ask consideration for the mural at the 660 in the future, that if the ownership changes, that the board request that that mural be eliminated.
May I address again? Is this on? I think it's turned off. The owner approached me before he painted the mural, asking if it was possible to paint it, and I told him, no, not without an architectural variance request form. The mural went up without any discussion with the board or the architectural committee. We approached the code compliance officer who came out and looked at the property and was okay with it because a hedge had been planted afterwards to cover it up. We were hoping the code compliance officer would say take it down, but he was okay as long as it was not visible to the street with the hedge. The owner did receive a $1,000 fine for painting that and paid it, and there is a written stipulation that when that unit sells, it's to be painted over. It's there for his enjoyment, which is now being hidden behind a hedge, but putting up that hedge kind of moved us in the wrong direction because it covered up a Vista View concrete block wall. And so our hope is that in the future, when someone buys that unit, this is the unit that also has that room addition, that the room addition will come down, the mural will get painted over, the hedge will come down, it'll start moving back into the right direction for that unit. But there is a stipulation, the owner has to paint over that when the unit sells.
Okay, thank you so
Okay,
much.
sure.
I can see you guys are on it.
Yeah, we're working hard out there, we're trying.
I can see that.
Thanks.
Okay. Board, any other further questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, may I have a motion, please?
Sure. I would like to make a motion to recommend recommend nomination of designation of a historic district for Marito Manor based on a staff report outlining the 10 historic defining characteristics and also outlining the 11 non-contributing features in the staff report.
I'll second the motion with an addition that staff continue to work.
Ms. Dixon, if you could turn your microphone on.
I'm sorry, that staff continue to work on guidelines with the HOA?
Yes, and we've got that as a condition.
Okay.
Excellent. So we have a motion by Mr. Nelson and a second by Ms. Dixon. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries 4-0.
Thank you.
Good. Congratulations. Okay, we are down
I
to...
have one comment to make.
Yes, of course.
I'm very impressed with your code violations for short-term rentals. You've really made an effort to make certain that your place stays a neighborhood.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll now move on to 2C. It's an application for the Desert Holly Homeowners Association for Historic District designation of the Desert Holly condominiums located at 2244 East Tockwitz Canyon Way. May I have a staff report, please?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. These are interesting that you have both of these coming before you because they're almost like companion pieces or bookends to the work that you're doing today. This is very similar to the one that you just considered. This is a proposed historic district of the Desert Holly condominiums. The proposed district would be comprised of the 14 dwelling units that are arranged in 8 buildings and encompass the common areas of the development, which totals just under 1 acre in size. The report was provided by the Palm Springs Preservation Foundation, which is the background for my report. As noted in the summary, this complex was developed in 1957. There was no identified architect of record, and the report asserts that the 8 buildings and common areas qualify as a historic district because they represent, again, a noteworthy example of the type of multifamily development that became popular in Palm Springs following World War II. They exemplify the distinctive characteristics of mid-century modern architecture. They exhibit a high level of quality of craftsmanship typically found in more expensive custom-built homes, and they are, as a proposed district, represent a distinctive entity whose individual parts, specifically the common areas, are not necessarily significant or distinctive. A little bit more background is provided on the project on page 2. And again, this has this is an interesting response and development to a period of time when Palm Springs was seeing a very large growth in population. And again, the information that I footnoted there about the growth in population is pretty dramatic. There's an aerial photo on page 3, and there is a diagram on page 5 that lists all of the homeowners, the buildings in which each unit is located, and a key plan that shows how those units are configured. Similar to the one that you just saw, I'm going to back up a moment. On page 4 is the set of requirements that must be submitted for consideration of a historic district. And again, there are photographs provided. We have the developer as William O'Brien, the date of construction of 1957, the period of significance as the post-World War II era. We've identified the distinctive design characteristics, and they've provided a bibliography of their material that they've proposed and presented for you today. I would note again on the top of page 6, item B, we're recommending a condition of approval that the architectural review design lines be developed into a concise set of design guidelines rather than simply relying on the architectural review board from their CC&Rs. And again, they have been willing to do so. Also, a note that not less than 50% of the property owners within the district support the nomination, and as you will see, they again have almost complete support from their association at the time that the application was submitted. The analysis of the application against the criteria in your ordinance begins on the bottom of page 6, and as I mentioned in the summary, this is representing a particular period of time in local history. It embodies distinctive characteristics of a type of construction, represents a very high degree of artistic value in terms of the unique collection of buildings, the angular geometry, and the very interesting detailing that the Desert Holly buildings possess. And then lastly, we've identified that the common open areas, parking and landscaping are somewhat lacking in distinction. However, some design components, and I'm reading from the page 8, some of the design components in the common areas, such as the 9-hole golf putting course and the shuffleboard court that have been removed over time, would also have been a significant component. However, the district as a whole can be deemed significant and noteworthy despite the loss of these integral features. The defining characteristics are identified for you on page 9, as well as the non-contributing elements. There have been some aluminum patio covers established on units 4, 9, 10, and 11. Again, we have recommended against contributing status for the parking areas, the common area landscapes, and the disparate amount of screen doors that have been added over time. So in conclusion, the Desert Holly Historic District application meets the definition of a historic district based on criterion 3, 4, 5, and 6. We're recommending that the board could recommend this to City Council as a historic district. That concludes my staff report. Again, this is a public hearing, and I'm available to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, board, are there questions of staff? Seeing no further.
Yeah.
Jay.
One question. Because the nomination packet with all the photos and all the history, because that went out before I joined the board, I haven't seen all of that. So my question is mainly with the common area landscape. Are there photos showing that common area landscape from when the property was built?
There are some fuzzy photos that and some diagrams from some of the sales and marketing brochures. And before I answer your question, I apologize because you had informed me that you needed that report, and while I was gone these past couple of days, I guess we didn't get that to you, so I really do apologize. We'll make sure that those get to you in advance if there's any others that have come in prior to your tenure in the board.
Oh, okay.
But there was discussion in the Historic Resources report about the small 9-hole putting green and a shuffleboard court, and it's vaguely discernible in some of the original photos, and if you want me to find those for you in that report, I'll try to do so. Those items and elements have been lost over time. They're the kinds of things that if the homeowners association felt inspired to do so, we think it would be a good thing to try to add them back in, but we did not make that a condition of approval.
Okay, thank you. One more thing. I was able to do a site visit, and the common area central courtyard around the pool was quite lovely and quite spectacular. So maybe if the applicant or a resident of Desert Holly is here, they could come up and speak to that current landscape and how it relates to what the original landscape was and whether they have any intent to take it back or if they like it the way it is now.
Right.
Thank you.
Actually, that's the next thing on the agenda. Is seeing any further questions of staff? I'm going to open the public hearing. And would the applicant please come forward?
Good morning, I'm Ron Marshall from the Palm Springs Preservation Foundation, and I hear the echo off the background. That's very unnerving. That's the way it is, huh?
The way it is.
Okay, but we do have Jim Hanlon from Desert Holly here in the audience, and he'd be happy to make some comments. We do, Jay, specific to your question, we do have a highly idealized architectural rendering of Desert Holly, and that's what we placed on the cover. It's not exactly what was built. We have to bear that in mind. I think the most notable feature are the saguaro cacti that are, one pierces an eave on the property. If anything should be retained, it probably should be those saguaro. They're non-native. They were put in the idealized rendering. So I think that if there was any landscape feature that should be retained, sort of like the Twin Palms of Frank Sinatra's Twin Palms estate. I think the saguaro are certainly worthy of retention and protection.
And they are listed as a defining characteristic.
Yes, in Ken's very beautiful staff report.
Thank you.
This is our 10th nomination and our second Historic District nomination, and your favorite is always the last one you've done, so Desert Holly is our favorite nomination right now. It's appropriate that the Palm Springs Municipal Code recognize master builders, because we really have had some extraordinary builders here in the city. Alva Hicks, Boris Gertzen, Bob Higgins most particularly, and I think it's appropriate that William J. O'Brien, while not as prolific, was certainly just as skilled. And as you read in the staff report, William J. O'Brien did his own house in Long Beach in 1949, a very modern house, ironically with a shed roof, and that's what you find throughout Desert Holly. He also, prior to working at Desert Holly, did collaborate with Ken Wing and Eugene Choi. If you remember that name, I only know him because of some screen block research. He did some great electronics plant in Southern California that has a big giant wall of screen block and a folded plate roof. And Schulman took beautiful photos of it, Eugene Choi. So Chinese-American architect, very well known in Long Beach. If you visited the site, you know that the architecture is absolutely striking. It is unadorned. It is as material as you can get. Jade, you might remember 15 years ago, everybody around town said, oh, that's an Eastward Williams. That's definitely an Eastward Williams building. And then when that was discredited, oh, that's definitely a Howard Lapham building. Because there was a time when everything that we didn't know what it was, we called it Howard Lapham. You probably recall it. Anyways, the only quibbles I have with an otherwise beautiful, brilliant staff report are twofold. One, I do think that the parking spaces should be part of the nomination as contributing. Barbara wrote a nice little paragraph in there about Sir Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City movement and the idea that you're supposed to push the parking out of the city. Get it out. It's a sign of urban distress. You don't want to look at your cars. And not only is it pushed out in our little mini Garden City here at Desert Holly, but there's even a wall. There's also a 5-foot wall. You really don't want to look at those cars. And I think it's important to add it back in, Ken, most particularly because Desert Holly is currently considering redoing their parking structure. I think they're going to probably change the rather unsightly asphalt. I know it's hard to love parking. But I think that it's an integral part of the design. You have these beautiful rectilinear buildings all looking into that central courtyard. And it's a nice blobby swimming pool to kind of soften the rectilinear architecture. I mean, it's really a lovely composition, and so much of it has stayed intact, mostly because of the materials. That concrete block loves the desert, no doubt about it. The few things that are problems, a couple of people have closed in or put overhangs on the patios, things like that. Everything is reversible. That's what I really liked about Desert Holly. Sometimes we go in and we say, oh, yuck, yuck, yuck. But here we can say yuck, but that's reversible. Yuck, but we can take that off too. And I think that there's a good attitude on this HOA at Desert Holly. They have waited patiently. Again, they've been kind of in the queue for a few years. They've asked us over the years, can we become a historic district? Us as in PSPF. We've had a lot of things on our plate. We always tell them, get owner support, get owner support. And sometimes it takes years to get this owner support. And they finally have it there at Desert Holly. So we're very happy about that. I would ask, so to recap, would like to include the parking lot, the external perimeter parking lot if possible. We gave Ken yesterday a revised nomination only because I thought it was important to go ahead and identify the original wall. This is included in the nomination, so this is actually extra information. So in 10 years, when a future planner looks at it, they'll see where the original wall was. The gates, of course, were added for security over the years. And they're also identified as either contributing or non-contributing. If possible, we would love to get a waiver from this extra design guidelines because we submitted it sort of early in March, and I think we were still operating under the old ordinance, so we would be happy to be relieved of that condition if at all possible. And Member Dixon's comment about historic districts and condominiums, I know that the city has gone down this path of condominiums being historic districts, these complexes, and the rationale is fairly solid, excuse me, with regard to complex ownership, multiple APNs. But I think that there is that rare, Ken said it perfectly, they're unique. They are unique because the other historic districts, buildings built at different times, different architects. In Las Palmas Business District, we're talking about different styles. We're mixing modern with Spanish revival, stuff like that. So in those cases, you really do need to have design districts to keep the whole giant block or two or three coherent. But these little condominium complexes, I don't know that we really need to have CC&Rs, a Class 1 nomination or a nomination that goes into great detail about the contributing and non-contributing features and have design guidelines on top of that. So maybe it's within the discretion of the Director of Planning Services even to possibly waive this requirement. I understand it's in the ordinance, but certainly it's within his discretion to waive these, maybe for these condominium complexes, because the fact of the matter is a rule or regulation or requirement that adds no value is bad policy. Having been a bureaucrat myself, that's what my boss told me. Anyways, I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, Jim from Desert Holly is here. And I have 2 minutes for rebuttal. Not that I'm going to rebut anyone. But if you have any follow-on questions, I'd be happy to answer them downstream. Ken?
Okay. Yes, Mr. Lyon.
Mr. Chair, could I ask a question of
Sure.
Mr.
Yes,
Marshall?
of course.
In the material that you submitted yesterday,
Yes.
is this the primary change, or was there other changes to content?
There were no other changes to content. It was more helping you write the resolution. I went ahead and did a long list of contributing, non-contributing, and stuff that had been lost. And I think it tracked with some of your questions you had done earlier.
Okay.
See, we didn't know you were going to fast track this, and we certainly appreciate it, and we certainly appreciate the positive recommendation for this. But in order to complete the record and answer all your questions, that's why we did that revision.
Thank you. When I saw it on my desk this morning, I was trying to discern. I was like, how am I going to decide what was the revisions in that? So this helps. This helps a lot.
This helps, and for the board's edification, along with these Linda, for PSPF, we actually post all of these online. So if you go on the PSPF website, every one of these nominations that we've done, dozens, are readily available to the public. Also, for the edification of the board, we provide Ken and staff with a hard drive. Has 144 photos on it of Desert Holly from various perspectives, so that the entire site is well documented. So in the future, when a board says, was that conduit always there? Was that awning there? It's all there. And Ken is very good, because sometimes he'll say, you didn't give me a picture of the patio of building, unit, we're like, son of a gun, he's right. We didn't do that. So we actually went back and took some extra photos and also described the photos in more detail. Sir?
Are they on that disc too?
Yes, they are.
Beautiful. Thank you, sir.
And we're really fortunate because Desert Holly was so well documented. We have that in the bibliography, all the places it appeared in the paper. They were really pushing it. It was intended to be 46 units, essentially 14, 14, 14, 14 was what they were pushing. And we saw that in the desert a lot. Desert Braemar was 100 units, so it was supposed to be 200, but they wanted to do these in stages, and they kind of wanted to pump and dump these condominiums. And so there's a lot of documentation. It's an interesting little interest. I tried to make it interesting as far as the times it popped up in the local media with regard to, come and, well, look at them, the snowbirds putt-putting on the putt-putt course. And that was apparently quite the novelty. And so we tried to make it as interesting as we could and as short as we could, because we have this charge to keep these suckers concise, and we're trying to do that. So I think that's all I have.
Thank you, Ron. And I just want to publicly acknowledge one more time again how much we appreciate not only this nomination, but all of the ones. I mean, you really give this board a lot of purpose for being.
Anything to make Dr. David Reddy look good, that's what I always say.
Exactly. We greatly appreciate it, and the level of detail that you go in and the passion that you and all of your board puts into it. We really do appreciate it very, very much.
Thank you, Dick. Appreciate it.
One question for Mr.
Sir.
Marshall before he goes. Because I wasn't able to read the nomination packet, can you just share very briefly, did William J. O'Brien have a practice here, or did he work with William Cody, or did he?
No, he variously described as the builder, the contractor, the designer, the developer, the owner, the manager. He called himself everything. He took full credit. He did rub elbows. I think he sort of, I get the impression he's sort of like Joe Pauling, who rubbed elbows with Don Wexler and
Right.
Rick Harrison, and then decided, I'm smart enough to do this by myself, and started building modernist houses himself. Now, in Pauling's case, of course, he eventually became an architect. He got registered as an architect, but he started off as a builder who was essentially doing knockoffs of Wexler and Harrison stuff. William J. O'Brien did come from a family of builders in Long Beach. His dad was a builder, so he came by it legitimately, honestly. And he seemed to be fascinated with mid-century architecture, again, as early as '49. His house is still standing in Long Beach, and it's quite the modern effort for 1949.
Great, thank you. The reason I mentioned Cody was because I couldn't help, at the site, notice the similarities between the Verizon. The siding of the buildings and the angle of the eave, and just so many similarities. So I just wondered if maybe he was influenced by that at all.
Not being an architect like Ken, I was quite unnerved. I could not figure out the roof line of this thing, because it is essentially just a shed roof. But by virtue of the fact that he notches the roof plane and creates these stunning little projecting eaves, it's really quite brilliant. And maybe that's something sometimes a builder can, they say, oh, I think I could do this. I need to use this somewhere. Well, they sure used it a lot at Desert Holly. It makes the whole composition quite striking, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other public comments from the audience? Oh, please come forward, state your name, and speak into the mic, please.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Jim Hanlon, and I'm a resident at Desert Holly. I also serve on the HOA Board of Directors. And we've talked a couple of times about the homeowners' support for historic designation. I'd like to say that it's, at this point, 100%, and it is very enthusiastic support for this designation. We're all very proud of the property that we have there. We've done everything we can to maintain it and to enhance it within, historical guidelines. And to Ron's point about some of the original improvements, like the shuffleboard court and the pitch and putt, those have been removed over time, but we actually have, not me personally, but owners over time have maintained bits and pieces. For instance, we do have about 6 of the original 9 flags of the pitch and putt course. And there is some, in the original marketing materials, some documentation of the shuffleboard court and the bench. So we're very interested in restoring those amenities at the appropriate time. But also, as an aside, I moved here about 4 years ago from Houston, Texas. And I just want to say to this entire room that it is just so wonderful to see such a passionate discussion about architectural preservation, because in Houston, this is not a common conversation. So on a personal note, I'm very thrilled to be here and very excited about this. And I want to thank Ron and Barbara and the Preservation Foundation. They've been so great to work with. I feel like they're friends at this point. And we also really appreciate the HSPB's consideration. And Ken, thank you so much for what you've done for us as well.
You're very welcome.
So I can answer any questions if you have any. I'll do my best. Okay.
Jade.
I have a question. Can you speak a little bit to the perimeter wall, the concrete block wall, and how that has changed over time?
To the best of my knowledge, Jay, the perimeter concrete block wall has not been changed. I think that has remained the same. And I'm not sure about the gates. I think the gates have been replaced over time with something a little bit more sturdy. I do know that there is some newer concrete block work on the interior, which is pretty easy to pick out. Ron and Barbara have documented all of that because it doesn't have the original painted grout line. But to my knowledge, the exterior wall is original. And we have a wonderful photograph in the application, almost like a Polaroid. I don't think that existed then, but it was a photograph of the initial construction showing that concrete block wall being erected. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. We
Thank
greatly
you.
appreciate your coming. Any other public comments? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing. The action is now with the board. Comments and questions, please. Board, any questions? Comments? I would just like to make a couple comments. One, I particularly was rather amused. I thought it was great. There was a piece of plywood that was covering a service area that had screen block painted on it, the screen. I thought that was really quite interesting that this complex is very serious about what they're doing. So I thought that was just a point I wanted to mention. I also find that the no carport and our garages being visible from the units are really quite refreshing, which supports the observation that was made about the parking. Very, very refreshing. You don't see that really a lot. You'll see it in a resort. You see it in La Horizon as an example, and many resorts, actually, many. but you don't see it in complexes very much. And when you do, there's something about them that's very distracting. For some reason, the way this is laid out, it's not distracting. So I think there's a very interesting point that was made about the parking. So those are my comments. If there's no other comments, yes.
So Mr. Marshall in his remarks had alluded to the parking areas surrounding the complex to be considered a contributing feature.
Right.
And I guess my question is, do you wish for that parking area to remain black asphalt? Or if at some point in the future they wanted to change it and pave it and make it concrete, would that be in line with your wishes?
I think the clever bureaucratic way to do this, and Ken, correct me if I'm wrong, is to go ahead and say that the current design of the parking lot is contributing and leave the materiality part out. I think that they intend to replace the asphalt with concrete at a later date, and just as long as it stays in its current configuration. And that current configuration of the parking lot is on the site plan. Here you see actually each unit is assigned a parking spot, these AAAs, and that configuration I think should certainly stay consistent, and they intend to keep it consistent and just change the asphalt to concrete. So I think if that's the way to do it as the current design of the parking lot is contributing.
What you might want to consider as a board is this is really a parking lot. This is, for all intents and purposes, bay parking. So if you concur with the notion that the parking areas should be included in the defining characteristics, you might say the parking area, the bay parking, and the uncovered parking. If the quality of this being uncovered is what is germane, then you may want to express that. Trying to think through the kinds of things that would come up, this is exactly the kind of thing that would come up as a homeowners association might at some time in the future want to try to approach the city to try to create covered parking. If that notion were to come forward because it's part of a historic district, whether it's contributing or not, it would likely come before the board. But if the board wants to underscore the notion that this is uncovered perimeter parking, regardless of what the material is on the pavement, that's how you might characterize this. If it's asphalt now, the current city parking ordinance requires that bay parking be of decorative concrete or pavers. You might, in order to sort of leave that part open to how the homeowners want to do it, say that if the uncovered perimeter parking is the characteristic, stated as such. And then when that comes through with the potential in the future where they say we want to put covers on this, a future board will have to contend with that.
Yeah, I don't think there's any, there's no current plan to put covers on it. It's really just going to be a replacement of the asphalt with concrete in the current configuration. And I just think it should be recognized as part of the overall design theme. The units looking inward to the idyllic oasis and the signs of urban distress, i.e. cars, on the perimeter. So however we want to do that. I mean, if it's more useful to leave it out completely, I think that we discuss why we think that that's an important design element. If it's easier to leave it out as an item like you have, easier in the sense that the HOA will be able to just replace it when they want to. But now you're telling me that the HOA may have to put pavers in or something a little more decorative than just good old beautiful concrete.
Well, no, they may put in decorative concrete. They may put in tinted concrete. The notion with bay parking is simply that it may no longer be simply asphalt. the city recognizes that when you
Okay.
have these conditions of bay parking, it really begins to expand the paved area that's part of the realm of the public street. So the ordinances in the city's parking ordinance says that bay parking needs to either have tinted, pigmented, decorative, stamped concrete, or other decorative surface.
Okay.
So again, I go back and say, if the notion of the board is that the parking as open parking at the perimeter is the characteristic that you believe is important enough to characterize as a defining characteristic, that may be the way that you want to phrase that. If the board feels that it's fine the way it is and leave it as a non-defining characteristic, you can do that too. It's your prerogative to what you want to define within this list. And then it's the city council's prerogative to agree or disagree.
That's what you want to do.
Mr. Chair, I have
Yes,
a question.
Dixon.
So that would mean if they wanted to replace the asphalt, if they want to Surrey seal and just fix, they're free to maintain it as is
Yes,
for as long as they like. It's if
Yes.
they actually pull everything up.
Correct.
Then they have to go to the new standards.
that's correct.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that the discussion of replacing it is Linda, they have slurry sealed it so much that it's not looking very nice right now. So I think that they're ready to go to the next level and go ahead and replace that asphalt. With regard to your question about the walls, Jade, the architectural rendering does show all these walls exactly as configured. The only difference is that the architectural rendering shows 2 walls between 2 patio or patio walls. Those aren't extant. Here's the architectural rendering, and we poured over every detail of this thing. The gates were not there. They were openings, no doubt put in for security over the years. And if you take a look at the gates, you see that they're fairly recent gates. There was a mention of newer concrete block. What was done was some of the, there were some low walls put in to hide trash cans. And what we've done with this little site plan is we've identified for Ken all those non-contributing little extra walls that were put in. They're in red here, and they're identified as non-contributing because, yeah. So we've already identified those, and that's one of the things that Ken had asked about, that we had modified the report slightly to include this, which answers about 90% of his questions.
Great, thank you for clarifying. The main reason I asked about the asphalt was mainly because of the color of it, the fact that it's black.
Yes.
And because the building is black and white, when you see it from the street, and if you look at this rendering here, you see how the asphalt flows right from the street into the parking. So it was part of the architectural concept that there was this flow. So that asphalt is a volume, which is part of the design. So that's why I asked if there were plans to make it concrete, because concrete would be gray, and the block walls are all gray. And so that begins to change the original.
I see where you're heading with that. You know, of course, they put in concrete culverts since then, and regular sidewalks and things like that. So they sort of compromised.
Yeah.
But that's actually very perceptive of you. I hadn't noticed that.
Okay, so that was my point.
Good point.
Thank you. I love these discussions. This is great. So may I have a motion, please? Pardon? No, I don't make motions. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, I really usually leave it up to you guys, but I'm happy to do that. I'd like to make a motion that we move to accept the nomination for the Desert Holly as stated in the staff report. And I think we just need a modification in reference to the parking.
And what is that modification that you'd like?
I think we've all agreed that
To include current design and configuration parking that includes
Right.
bay parking and uncovered parking.
because that's a part of actually
That was the recommendation.
Right,
If we wanted
yeah.
to include the parking.
Right, that's what I was referring to.
And if I may add, that at such time, the HOA should determine to replace the asphalt, that it would come before the board to determine what material they use, whether it's a paver or a poured concrete. And additionally, that all sawaras on the property be included as character-defining features, not just the one that's listed in the list of 11.
Okay, that would be fine with me for the motion.
I'll second the
So
motion
we-
with all the amendments.
Okay, we have a motion by Dick Burkett and a second by Linda Dixon. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries 4-0.
Mr. Chair, does the board want to take a 5-minute break? It's now 11:30.
Yes.
Would that be helpful?
Oh, my gosh. Okay,
Yes.
let's do it.
Okay.
Okay, we will
Thank you.
recess for 5 minutes.
to go back to my favorite church in Grand Rapids that I just. Fiance arranged with a friend of his to fly her in. So she literally, the bride arrived by airplane. It was pretty cool. Mr. Chair, we're ready to reconvene.
Okay, thank you. So we'll reconvene our meeting. Item 3 is unfinished business. There is none. So we will move into new business, which is an application by William and Jennifer Nelson Thane for Class 1 Historic Resource Designation of the J. Cheney Wells residence located at Rock 12 in Smoke Tree Ranch, 1850 Smoke Tree Lane.
Mr. Chair?
Yes,
I'm sorry.
Mr. Lyon.
Mr. Chair, as is typical when we receive reports, this is our recommendation to you to receive the report and direct us to schedule site visits and to schedule a public hearing for the board to consider the application.
Thank you. I would like to make a motion to accept the Historic Resources Report and schedule site visits. Do I have a second? First by Member Burkett, second by Member Dixon. So we have a, excuse me, any further discussion? Seeing none, those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries 4-0.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're down now to discussions, the symposium. I guess that would be me. So quick update on the symposium. Great news in that Dave Binder, the general contractor for the Steve McQueen restoration. Thank you very much, Ken, for a different approach tip. It worked when I talked to Mr. Binder about creating an interview concept with a small panel. So that is now, we're working on the details of that. We'll be talking about workshop venue options on for April 19th, which is our second day. We'll be discussing that at our late October subcommittee meeting. And the What Does Preservation Mean to Palm Springs panel, that is almost set. Just one more person we're needing to confirm. And I'm also extremely happy to report that the tramway construction panel with Jim Landell, he's the son of Jim Landell, who was the helicopter pilot that made it all happen, has agreed to be on the panel, as well as Steve Nichols, whose grandparents gave the land for the Tramway Valley Station. And it'll be monitored by Joey English, a local radio host. And this presentation has been done one other time, and it really is quite exciting and definitely falls into our unique places in Palm Springs as a theme. On the workshops, Tracy Conrad has agreed to do a Smoke Tree Ranch presentation, which we've been trying to have for quite some time. And we are working on several others. Also, we'll have in November, we will be getting the organization's representatives again together for a subcommittee meeting, and we'll be talking about their input and what they would like to do for this coming year with tours and with workshops. So that is my symposium update. Any questions? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to board comments. So board, may I have your comments, please?
I have one question, staff. Inspiration Point, you said you were working with the owner? Do we know if that will ever go to council, when it'll go to council, what?
It will go to council. It will either go with owner support or it will go with owner opposition. I don't have a date at this time because I have been still trying to work with the applicant or the owner of the land to be willing to support the nomination in some form. So that's really where I'm at right now. I had spoken with them about a week ago, and I'll be following up this next week as I have been. So I don't have a date yet for it to go to city council, but at some point we will carry it forward either with owner opposition or with owner support.
Will it be before the end of the year, before a new council is?
It will not be before a new council is seated. It will be sometime after the November 5th election.
All right, thank you for that.
Any other comments? Mr. Nelson?
Yeah, I just would like to bring up what Chris Manrad came up and spoke about in the public comments. And if possible, I would like city staff to speak to what happened around 423 Marito Place so that it's in the record, so that everyone knows.
Sure.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Sorry, before we go into that, we will address that as a separate item under staff comments. but
reports,
Just
right.
wanted to get the rest of
That's,
your.
that's what I was going to say, right. Mr. Kaiser, any comments? No. Okay, I have a few. First of all, I spoke with the board maybe back in June about having some sort of extracurricular visits for educational purposes that are not site visits for nominations. And I have worked with Lance O'Donnell about him doing a tour for the College of the Desert campus in Palm Springs to learn about how those 5 local architects approach design of those many buildings under the direction of a master architect, John Warnke. So in doing so, Mr. Fagg is checking with the attorney, read the board being unaccompanied, which would be October 25th, which is the only days of Fridays that actually Lance can do the tours. So we have to see if that is allowable without staff. We would love to have staff join us, but we also know that City Hall's closed that day.
Yeah, I don't know that this will fall under requirement for Brown Act notification, as it's outside of the city, number one, and secondly, it's not relative to anything that will be on a forthcoming agenda. But again, I'll check with the attorney on that, and staff will plan on joining you if we can attend.
Wonderful. That would be great. And so then after we get that information and that clarification, then staff will send out a notice to all of the, okay. That would be wonderful. It would be in the morning, and it would be like starting at 8:30. So, next item. I'd like to ask if there's any update about the Orchid Tree Inn. I know that their entitlements are running out in November, and I know there were some things in the progress. So anything new to add to that?
Yeah, just a little bit additional information. As you've mentioned, their 2016 entitlements will expire in November unless extended by the Planning Commission. The applicant has submitted a new application to not only incorporate the Orchid Tree properties as we know them currently, which includes the community church and the bungalow court, but also to include 3 additional properties on the north end of the block that weren't previously incorporated. The application was incomplete when it was submitted to us. We are reviewing it now for completeness. If the application moves forward in the process, it will be scheduled for review by the HSPB at a future date.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So that's in progress. Okay, the next thing is I'd just like to acknowledge Ken for speaking to neighborhood associations. I understand Vista Las Palmas, you'll be talking with them, I believe, about the new historic preservation ordinances. Is that
I will be.
right?
Right.
Which is, this kind of thing, this community outreach, I really appreciate you doing that. I think this is a wonderful way for, you can see, sometimes you see a lot of things on social media that if people just understood more about the ordinances and how things worked, it would be a tremendous help. So I'd like to encourage more of that kind of outreach, and I know we have you stretched from one end to the other. But if it would be possible at some time that we could even approach the 1PS for other organizations, and I don't want to volunteer you for one more thing. First of all, I can't volunteer you, but suggest. But it's so important, and I think this outreach to the community, I'm getting a lot of good feedback that they really appreciate what the city is doing and trying to do more outreach to the community.
Well, thank you. And we did do an outreach to 1PS back as we were rolling out the new ordinance, but we can certainly arrange with Denise Goolsby to do some follow-up, and I'm happy to work with her to try to do so.
That would be wonderful. That's great. Okay, one thing I'd just like to report, and that is Class 2 nomenclature based on experience with our recent Liberace nomination that we had, the one in Kiowa. It occurred to me that it's the label of Class 2 that can have a very negative impact and an inference. So I've recommended to Mr. Fagg that could we consider a simple name change that could make the difference in the perception. And one of the things that he had recommended, I hope it's okay for me to say this, is a structure of merit versus a Class 2. I think, this was our first experience of reviewing a property that we had recommended for a Class 2. And if we can, anything we can do again, I think for the public and the residents, if it's a simple matter of a name being offensive, then this is a small thing we could do. I'd really like to, so I don't know if we need to put that on new business, Lynn, for the future.
I'll address that under staff comments.
Okay,
I do have an
very
item
good.
coming forward that you'll be interested in.
Okay. All right. And then also, I believe, Flynn, you'll report on a plan to add properties to the survey. Okay, you're going to be talking about that. And also, just two things. For those who are interested in Rancho Mirage history, Melissa Ritchie is going to be doing two presentations, one actually on the 15th at 2 o'clock, talking about the historic neighborhoods of Rancho Mirage at the Rancho Mirage Library. There's no reservation required, but they always sell out. So if you're interested, it's really important to get there earlier. On November the 10th at 10, she's also doing a presentation on how to research your home's history. And this basically is a repeat of what she did for our 2019 workshop, and reservations are required for that. That's the end of my staff comments.
If I may, I have a couple more comments before we get back to staff. Just to follow up, I believe in the last two meetings, in her comment, Member Dixon asked about the mid-century modern apartment complex on Camino Real, known as the Twin Palms. So that's 2 times now we've asked for an update on what's going on with that. And then additionally, I would like to ask about the former bank building across from Trio, which is part of the Las Palmas Business District. That's now owned by Mike Flannery of Acme. And that's been modified. They've taken off the entire sheathing of the building and they're redoing it. So I just wondered why that didn't come before HSPB if it is in fact part of the Las Palmas Business Historic District. Thank you.
Any other comments? Okay, I'd ask now for staff comments, please.
Okay. Just very quickly, responding to Member Nelson's comments, I don't have any additional information on Twin Palms apartment complex other than that the building permit has been dragging on for some period of time. I know exactly the complex that you're talking about because I run by there in the morning, so I see it. So we'll have to check on that for you and send an email. On the former bank building, because they are not adding square footage to it or significantly modifying the building other than the exterior skin of the building, it falls outside of the guidelines of the Las Palmas Business Historic District in terms of having to come before the HSPB. It did go before the Architectural Advisory Committee who reviewed those modifications to the building. So it did go through a public process. But again, based on the scope of work, it was not subject to the design guidelines. Other than materials, obviously it's consistent with the materials, et cetera, but there were no significant changes to the building. With that, there have been questions under public comment about 423 Morito. What I'd like to do is turn that over to Ken to just review with you his process in reviewing the proposed changes to that. After Ken makes his comments, I'm going to talk to you generally about the different classes and the approval process for each of those. I've got a little sheet for you that I'll hand out, and then I'll address some of the other questions that Chair Burkett has brought up relative to Class 3, the nomenclature, and then how we add to the Class 3 list. So with that, I'll turn that over to Ken.
Thank you. What I'm passing around to you is just a brief synopsis of what the processing was that was conducted on 423 Morito Place. This application came to the Planning Department on May 29th. The normal manner in which these things come in is person will normally walk into the development services area. They are looking around for what department to start with, and of course, when these kinds of things come in, we start with planning. When an application comes in for a change or proposed modification, the first thing we do is check the Class 3 list. This building was not on the Class 3 list. Therefore, it is, by definition, automatically Class 4. If you recall, the distinction between Class 3 and Class 4 is that Class 3 were those items that were identified through the HRG citywide survey of potentially eligible sites. Class 4 is any structure that was built in the city prior to 1978. So the building was not on the Class 3 list. We reviewed it as Class 4. The ordinance says that if you're doing anything on a Class 4 building, whether it's major or minor in its nature, it's a review responsibility of the Historic Preservation Officer, myself at this time. And so we did review this at staff level. The only time a Class 4 comes before the board is if it's a full demolition. So when the project came before me and I reviewed it, it was a scope to relocate the front door, to add a garage door to the carport, and to replace 5 sliders along the back of the home with stacking sliding glass doors. It was less than 25% of the front elevation and less than 50% of all elevations. However, as I did mention, as a Class 4, those criteria would not apply. Had this been a Class 3, those criteria would have applied. So just an important sort of minor detail to note. There was no review of the interior scope on this project because with private structures and privately owned sites, there is no review authority by HSPB or the HPO on alterations to the interior. When I reviewed the project, we recommended reuse and identified the importance of the facade in terms of its overall material characteristics, the pattern of fenestration, and that the building did have, from the point of view of street presence, a very attractive presence, and that they should work to integrate as much of the existing fabric into that structure in their new plans as they could. So the drawings that you see that are attached here It comes from the building permit set of drawings. And as you can see, the top image on this, and I'll hold this up so that you can see what I'm looking at. So the top image on this is the building as it existed. The bottom is the building as proposed. The three hourglass-shaped sconces, we had recommended that they be relocated and incorporated in some way, as well as the heavy vertical ribbed siding on which they're located, and the applicant agreed. That's really the full story behind what was processed with 423. It begs the question, why wasn't this on the Class 3 list rather than being a Class 4? And there is no defined or finite answer for that. We're finding as we go through these various sites, there are some that we question, why was it on the Class 3 list? There are others that we question, why wasn't this on the Class 3 list? One that we've discovered recently, and I have an ongoing list that I've actually talked with Chairman Burkett about, as we come up with sites that we see that are not on the Class 3 list that may be appropriate to be on the Class 3 list, we have started a list of those kinds of projects or properties. The one that I will give you as an example is the Saks Fifth Avenue building. The Saks Fifth Avenue building is a building by, I believe, Luckman and Perea from 1957, if I get my history right, that's at the corner of South Palm Canyon and Ramon. It's the building that has the lava rock and the scored, very decorative scored concrete block walls on the south facade. The primary facade, which on that particular building is the Palm Canyon fronting facade, has had substantial alterations done to it sometime in the 90s. I refer to it as the addition of the Hiroshima Dome. But kidding aside, it was there were some steel structures that were added across the front. The building in its original configuration had some exterior extended, I believe there were laminated beams that protruded out and provided part of a shade cover on that building's front storefront. The consultant, HRG, as they evaluated this building, found that there was, in their opinion, enough modifications that had been done that its integrity had been compromised. When you look at buildings and you think about them in places like Los Angeles or places like Santa Monica or I'm sorry, Santa Barbara or San Francisco, you're looking at buildings in most cases that have had a far greater level of articulation and design consideration given to them than many of our buildings here. We have tried to retain a lower threshold in terms of the buildings that we would consider, quote unquote, potentially significant. So even though the alterations that have been made on the Saks Fifth Avenue building, the addition of that steel dome and some of the other less than sympathetic additions, we felt, or we feel, that that building could still be potentially restored and brought back to being, quote unquote, potentially contributing. So it's one that we would like to have added on to the Class 3 list. There's a few others. Chair Burkett brought to our attention a building on Hermosa that's associated with Alva Hicks. So we have that added to the list. There's also all of the buildings in Smoke Tree Ranch. None of Smoke Tree Ranch was surveyed as part of the HRG survey because that's a gated community and they were unable to gain access. The same is true of Southridge. None of Southridge was surveyed as part of the citywide survey because it too is behind a gate. But there are obviously some significant home sites and buildings in that area as well. So what we've recognized is the Class 3 list is like any other survey which has been done in the past. And as you know, we've done them in 84, 87. The most recent one was done in 2004, which was a very, very limited survey. The current survey that we're working with, the current Class 3 list, is really the most comprehensive list that the city has ever had. Having said that, there are probably more that need to be added. There are probably some that shouldn't have been added. And so what Flynn will probably talk about next is we've been talking about how do we address this Class 3 list finding that there are buildings and sites around the city that perhaps do have enough significance to them or are potentially eligible for historic designation that never made it onto the list. And we need to come up with a program or a process by which those can be added. I believe what Flynn's passing around is our initial thoughts on how this might be done. Obviously, if you're a property owner, it would not be appropriate for the city to simply come along and one day say, well, you're not on the list and tomorrow you are. So we want to make sure that whatever process we use is an open process, a transparent process, and a process that property owners are participating in. If you recall, when we first put together this list and it was rolled out to the public, we did so during the process of the HRG citywide survey and the historic context report, which began, I believe, in 2015. And solicitation was sent out to all of the preservation organizations in the city, as well as those people that we know that have a keen interest in preservation, such as Tracy Conrad, who you mentioned earlier, Will Klein-Dietz, and others. So through that set of inquiries and sort of shaking of the trees, so to speak, the current Class 3 list was assembled. We then rolled that out to the city at large in the open house that we did last December, in which anybody whose property was listed on that Class 3 list was invited to come down and understand what it was, understand what it means to be on the list, what the opportunities and responsibilities are for homeowners who are in those areas where they own property that has the potential to be historically significant. So that's kind of the background of how the Class 3 list was established. We're recognizing that there are sites around the city that, as I say, may merit being on the list. There are others on the list that, upon further scrutiny, may want to be removed. But we want to make sure that we do so in a way that is a process that's fair, transparent, and one that is reliable or consistent, so that as staff positions change, as HSPB boards change, that we have a criteria in place that remains objective in terms of bringing projects onto that list. Is there something more that?
Yeah, let me go ahead and continue on. What I've passed out to you is what I consider to be kind of a cheat sheet in terms of the approval process for the 4 different categories of historic resources here in the city of Palm Springs. As you'll notice, Class 1 and Class 2, any major alteration or demolition comes before the HSPB. It's only minor alterations that are approved at a staff level. Now, Class 3 structures, which are identified as those as being potentially eligible for designation but aren't designated, still have the same protections in place as Class 1 and Class 2 in terms of the approval process. As you'll note there, both major alterations and demolitions still come to the Historic Site Preservation Board. So even though they're not designated, they still have the same review process and protections that are in place. Now, it's only the Class 4 where those are approved, the minor and major alterations are approved administratively by the Historic Preservation Officer. Demolitions, of course, would come to you all for your review and approval. So again, this is just a handy sheet for everyone to have so that you understand who approves what relative to the 4 different classes. Now, the questions that arose from the property at 423 Morito are serious, that we take those seriously, the questions that come up. Number one, the first thing that we ask ourselves is, did staff apply the ordinance correctly? So that's why I had Ken go back and take a look at the construction documents, review what he had reviewed to make sure that he was applying the ordinance correctly. So that's the first thing that we look at. Secondly, we also look at, did the applicant fail to disclose the full scope of work, or have they performed work outside of the scope of the permit? If they have, then there's penalties that would apply in that situation. But those are the first 2 things that we look at when we have reports of work being done on properties. Another thing that's very important for us to consider as the Historic Site Preservation Board is, are there structures, as Ken has already indicated, are there structures out there that aren't on the Class 3 list that should be there? Now, you as the board have given those to us in the past. Ken is keeping his list, as he had mentioned. And then the fourth thing that we also look at is the structure identified on the HSPB's work plan for designation? Every year, you look at a list of structures and identify for staff, these are the ones that we would like to put on for designation, either as a Class 1 or a Class 2. So it's important, if there are other things out there, that you all need to identify them. So that brings up the next point. How do we add things to the Class 3 list, as Ken has identified as being a transparent process so that the property owner is aware of our intent to do so? What I am recommending to you is that for ones that you all, as the Historic Site Preservation Board, want to add to the Class 3 list in order to have the same protections as Class 1 and Class 2, is that staff has prepared the DPR form. Sorry, old school, these have changed since.
It's the same.
It's okay. The DPR form, which basically identifies what characteristics of our ordinance or the criteria that it potentially could meet. And so it's an initial form or initial assessment of whether or not a property is eligible. And so what I would propose is, for those that you identify for us as staff should be Class 3, we will prepare the DPR form, and then we will bring those to you once the form is completed in a public hearing at the HSPB meeting for you all to add those to the Class 3 list. That way, in a public hearing, the property owner can participate, give input. You all can consider that as adding it to the list. And so this is something that we can do administratively. It doesn't require a change in our ordinance to do that. So we'll go ahead and begin that process for those properties that you've already identified and begin that work to bring that forward to you. So that's how we can add things to the Class 3 list. The final thing that, one other thing. Chair Burkett mentioned changing the names of our Class 1, Class 2, Class 3. Class 2 sounds a little bit like second-class citizen, and by no means is that what we wanted to do. When we talked about the revisions to our historic preservation ordinance last year in our subcommittee meetings, we looked at the potential terminology of using Class 1, having that be a landmark structure. Class 2 would be a structure of merit. Class 3 are potentially eligible structures. Class 4, I haven't come up with a name for that one yet. Basically anything older than 1978. So that's something that we can look at. Associated with that, the City Council, when they adopted the new historic preservation ordinance back in January, they asked us to come back to them before the end of the year with a report in terms of how the historic preservation ordinance is functioning. So on your next agenda, what we will do is we will take your input in terms of things that you would recommend in terms of updates, corrections, things like that to the ordinance. So we'll have that on the agenda. So some of the things that we can look at, we had a comment today about should condominium complexes be considered as a historic district. That's certainly something that we can forward to City Council. We can look at the names, we can look at those types of things. So we'll bring that to you in November. So those are my comments. And again, we'll go ahead and begin with the Class 3 structure process today.
So will then the Class 3 additions, would that sort of be done on a quarterly basis so that you're not like, or how do you want
We'll
that to?
bring them to you as quickly as we can. I don't think that we need to put any type of a schedule on that in terms of we can only do those on a quarterly basis. But rather, when we have a group that we can bring together to you, I think it's important that we bring those to you as quickly as possible.
Okay, so then the board should begin to start preparing their list.
Exactly,
what they
exactly.
should be,
And I
right?
realize the Class 3 list
Right.
is kind of overwhelming, but looking by street address, that's how it's organized. If there's a particular building or structure, its street address, we can review and see if it's on there already or not. So
Would it be possible that the board members have a copy?
Oh, absolutely,
of
absolutely.
this? That we could
Again,
start that.
it's some ways almost easier to have it electronically because you can blow it up to a level that it's readable.
Right. But I'm thinking if on a drive-by, that's where it would be helpful, if you have that right there with you. And, because I think this is a very integral part of what we need to be doing. So if we do that, that will start catching a lot of these properties. And then would also, at some point, and I think that's the neighborhoods we can see are the easiest to start with, and then maybe we could progress to some way getting into Southridge behind those gates, and then getting into Smoke Tree, which I'm sure we can probably get access to that. So, okay, so that's really good news. I do have a question, going back to 423 Morito. There were many items on the permit that I'm not sure if they were presented to Ken or not. Like there's the major addition, new living space between the wings and the rear to accommodate a new living room and a master bath. Remove a portion of the existing living room, extension of existing sloped roof from front to back, reclaim existing atrium. So I'm not sure that if those were brought there are not to your attention. Going back to what you had mentioned, Lynn, about did the owner divulge all the things that were going to happen on that property? So just like to ask that we take another look at that and see if to be sure that that was there.
I can speak to that to a certain degree. The drawings that represent the permit set, that's the set to which it's being built,
Right.
is not the set that I reviewed when it came before me for review. But I was aware of the changes in the back of the building. I was aware of the changes in the doors and the glass sliders. I was aware of the change in the location of the front door. I was aware of the infill of the small atrium at the front in order to move that door. And I was aware of the enclosure of the carport. The areas that I did not have an understanding of or an awareness of was the work that was going on the interior part of the home. Again, I don't pay attention to that
No.
at that point because I'm reviewing what's happening on the outside. And those items, none of them were such that, again, for a Class 4 building, would it rise to the level of us intervening and requiring a change in scope. But most of what is there on that site and what is there within the scope, I believe there's also a small infill of an area on the southwest corner of the back of the house. I can't say that I remember seeing that, to be very honest. But most of what that scope was scope that I was aware of.
Okay. All right, so that answers that question. Thank you very much. Mr. Nelson.
So a couple of things. On this chart about historic preservation approval process and authority and the listing here, thank you, this is very helpful. Under Class 1 and Class 2, it says under minor alteration, a building permit is reviewed and approved by the HPO and not the HPB. Can you tell me what is considered a minor alteration for Class 1 and Class 2?
Yeah. Minor alteration and major alteration are defined in our ordinance. And so minor alteration, and Ken, maybe you can go through. I'll have you do that since you deal with that on a daily basis.
If you go into your copy, and you all have copies of this ordinance, under the section of 8.05.020, the definitions, the definition defines a major alteration, and then it breaks it down into A, B, C, and D. And I can read those for you. A minor alteration is any alteration that is not a demolition or a major alteration. So you go back to what is a major alteration. And Mr. Chair, Would you like me to go through and read this for the edification of the board?
I think it'd be good.
Okay. So a major alteration means any alteration that does the following. A, removes 1, 25% or more of the lineal footage of the elevation of the building, structure, or object, including side and garden walls facing a public street or right-of-way, parenthetically, or a street-facing elevation if the parcel is a through lot or landlocked, close parentheses, or 2, more than 50% of the lineal footage of all exterior elevations of the building or structure so that they no longer function as exterior elevations of the building or structure. Okay? B, encloses or modifies, i.e., new windows and/or window relocation, subpoint 1, 25% or more of the lineal footage of the elevation of the building, structure, or object, including side or garden walls facing a public street or right-of-way, or a street-facing elevation if the parcel is a through lot or landlocked. This is the same as what we just read with Part A. Or 2, more than 50% of the lineal footage of all exterior elevations of the building or structure such that they are no longer functioning as exterior elevations. So in other words, A and B are looking at basically the same percentages. One is talking about modifying, one is talking about enclosing. Part C removes 50% or more of the cumulative area, i.e. square footage, of the building, structure, or object's footprint. Okay? And then D, the director shall have the authority to render determination as to whether this definition applies to the particular project. So if there's something that's coming close, the director has discretion to impose some of these characteristics on this and say, yes, it should be reviewed, or no, this can be reviewed at this level. So the way that the ordinance is written is it defines what is major, and then it says everything else is a minor. So when you go back to this list that he just summarized, this little summary chart, when it talks about major and minor, you really want to look at what's a major to understand what is a minor. I know that sounds like a play on words, but that's truly what it is. You're looking at the characteristics that qualify or constitute the definition of a major. If it isn't those things, then it's a minor. So if you're dealing with not more than 25% of the front elevation, then it's a minor. If you're dealing with not more than 50% of the perimeter elevations of the rest of it, then it's a minor. If you're removing less than 50% of the total cumulative area of the building, then it's a minor. So you really look at everything that's in a major. If it doesn't reach that threshold of the definition of a major, it's a minor. And then you go back into the little chart that Flynn provided for you today to identify then who has the review authority on that type of project.
I would like to recommend that the November meeting, if maybe we could call it a study session or put it under new business, that we have the full board here to have a discussion, particularly about Class 4, and in the event, because I think a lot of people, including myself, which I admitted to with Ken, was not aware that the HSPB is not included as a part for a major alteration in the event that the HPO wanted to just get an opinion on certain projects. So I think we could, and I think we talked about this, we can consider this as an amendment, I guess you would change.
Yeah, as we had talked about, what we'll do is, at our next meeting, talk about potential amendments to the ordinance that City Council will then review as part of their review of the ordinance itself.
Right. Okay.
And just to follow up on that, the HPO, the Historic Preservation Officer, in the ordinance currently has the ability to refer minor alterations on Class 1 and Class 2 to you, if he feels there's any question or if it goes beyond. He doesn't have that authority on Class 3 and Class 4, so that's something that we might look at.
Right. No, I see the restrictions, though. I thought we could have that discussion. Should that be under new discussion, or should we put that under a study session?
I think we could probably do it as a study session. We'll look and see how many items we've already got scheduled in terms of public hearing items and new business items that need action on that. And then, depending on that, we may do that as a separate study session. If the agenda is light, we'll keep it on the main portion of the agenda.
That would be great. Mr. Nelson?
Yeah, I had a couple other comments in regard to all of this 423 Merida. So, up until January, this would have been considered a Class 3. So I can't help but wonder if the parameters would have been different and it may have gotten more attention. The other thing is, considering that the survey is still in process, the current survey is not officially finished and adopted, it's just a little confusing to me and the organization and the board why a simple courtesy call wasn't made to a member of the board or a member of the local organization. What do you know about this house? Or what can you tell me before something happened? And I think in the case of its age, the fact that it was 50 South by one of our significant architects, and the fact that it was all original, should have warranted just that simple step before issuing any kind of permit. And I think a lot of people would agree with my sentiment on that.
Let me address your first question. Prior to the new ordinance in January, the class numbers changed. So Class 3 didn't exist. Class 3 as we have it now did not exist. And so what it would have been is just a structure that was older than 1969. So it wouldn't have had anything other than the fact that it was older than 1969. And if they were demolishing it, it would have come to the Historic Site Preservation Board, but the Historic Preservation Officer would not have reviewed the plans. So prior to January, Ken wouldn't have even looked at it. So that's the difference.
Okay, so on that note, I know that last year or 2 years ago, maybe, when Gary Johns was the chair, there was this whole discussion, and I'm not sure if it was ever put into action or adopted, that there would be a list at the planning department, and there would be a check mark or a flag next to properties based on their age and their originality in terms of integrity. So is that list at the planning department, and if so, why wasn't 423 Merida on that list? It's just so confusing because it won a preservation award, and it was original, and it was it just has so many things that it should warranted being on the list. So.
Yeah. Again, as Ken has explained, that our consultant went through the entire city and looked at properties that were potentially eligible. This was presented to the Historic Site Preservation Board in January of 2016, so it's been sitting around for a couple of years for people to review it. So again, if there are properties that are not on the Class 3 list that should be, those need to be identified. Also, you had mentioned that the survey has not been adopted. It was adopted, by City Council back in January, along with the ordinance itself. They did both of those actions at the same time. So, if it received a preservation award, I'm a little surprised that the owner at the time didn't submit it for designation. That would have been the perfect time to do it. Historic preservation is best when it's proactive as opposed to reactive.
I think this is just, in closing, I think this is a perfect example of how important it is for designations to happen, and that all of us in preservation communities, that we continue to do nominations so that we won't even be having this issue to talk about. So that's a great encouragement, I think, to everybody to how important it is. And we all know there's some very significant buildings that are not on that list yet. So I think it's a good thing for the community at large to realize, we really need to step up to the plate and get as many of these properties nominated for designation as possible. Yes, Mr. Lyon.
I also just want to respond to the question, well, why wasn't anybody in the community contacted? I don't usually make these decisions in a vacuum. You need to understand and appreciate that. And there have been instances where there was something that was not on the Class 3 list that I raised my eyebrows about. I gave you the example of the Saks building. In the case of the Saks building, I actually went back and called HRG. And I said, I'm scratching my head here. This is a building that, we have there's a good degree of local passion for, that we really appreciate this building, although it was actually slated for demolition, if you remember, for the One Palm Canyon project about 10 years ago. So I do take time when I can to query local people. When I see something that's coming in that looks a little bit peculiar, or that I think, boy, why isn't it? I do reach out when I can. So I don't want you to get the impression that these are decisions that are simply swept along within the tide of projects that come before my desk. I take these reviews seriously, and I am as passionate about preservation and that we're trying to do the right thing, I think, as you and all the others that are in the community that support preservation. So we do our best with the workload we have, the projects coming through. When we see these things like this, we do ask questions. When I spoke with the applicant on this one, as I mentioned, I identified to them, you've got a pretty darn nice building here. You want to try to incorporate as much of the existing fabric on it as you can as you're making these modifications. So I just want to let you know that we do take extra effort where we can to look into things when it looks a little bit strange. So thank you.
Thanks, Ken. And I don't know if there's anybody in this room that's any more passionate about preservation than you are, that's for certain. Okay, any other comments? If not, I will declare that the Historic Site Preservation Board will adjourn to its meeting in November
the 12th.
the 12th. Thank you very much.